Section 44 of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4, by James Boswell. Section 44. Feeling very soon that the manner in which he had written might hurt me, he 2 days afterwards, July 28, wrote to me again, giving me an account of his sufferings, after which he thus proceeds. Before this letter you will have had one, which I hope you will not take amiss, for it contains only truth, and that truth kindly intended, spartum quam noctus es orna. Make the most and best of your lot, and compare yourself not with the few that are above you, but with the multitudes which are below you. Go steadily forward with lawful business or honest diversions. Be, as Temple says of the Dutchman, well when you are not ill, and pleased when you are not angry. Footnote. Temple says of the spleen that it is a disease too refined for this country and people, who are well when they are not ill, and pleased when they are not troubled, are content because they think little of it, and seek their happiness in the common eases and commodities of life, or the increase of riches, not amusing themselves with the more speculative contrivances of passion or refinements of pleasure. End of footnote. This may seem but an ill return for your tenderness, but I mean it well, for I love you with great ardor and sincerity. Pay my respects to dear Mrs. Boswell, and teach the young ones to love me. I unfortunately was so much indisposed during a considerable part of the year, that it was not, or at least I thought it was not, in my power to write to my illustrious friend as formerly, or without expressing such complaints as offended him. Having conjured him not to do to me the injustice of charging me with affectation, I was with much regret long silent. His last letter to me then came, and affected me very tenderly. To James Boswell, Esq. Dear Sir, I have this summer sometimes amended and sometimes relapsed, but upon the whole have lost ground very much. My legs are extremely weak and my breath very short, and the water is now increasing upon me. In this uncomfortable state your letters used to relieve. What is the reason that I have them no longer? Are you sick, or are you sullen? Whatever be the reason, if it be less than necessity, drive it away. And of the short life that we have, make the best use for yourself and for your friends. I am sometimes afraid that your omission to write has some real cause, and shall be glad to know that you are not sick, and that nothing ill has befallen dear Mrs. Boswell or any of your family. I am, Sir, your, etc., Sam Johnson. Lichfield, November 5th, 1784. Yet it was not a little painful to me to find, that in a paragraph of this letter, which I have omitted, he still persevered in arraigning me as before, which was strange in him who had so much experience of what I suffered. I however wrote to him 2 as kind letters as I could, the last of which came too late to be read by him, for his illness increased more rapidly upon him than I had apprehended, but I had the consolation of being informed that he spoke of me on his deathbed, with affection, and I look forward with the humble hope of renewing our friendship in a better world. I now relieve the readers of this work from any farther personal notice of its author, who, if he should be thought to have obtruded himself too much upon their attention, requests them to consider the peculiar plan of his biographical undertaking. Soon after Johnson's return to the metropolis, both the asthma and dropsy became more violent and distressful. He had for some time kept a journal in Latin of the state of his illness, and the remedies which he used, under the title of Agere Ephemeris, which he began on the 6th of July, but continued it no longer than the 8th of November, finding, I suppose, that it was a mournful and unavailing register. It is in my possession, and is written with great care and accuracy. Still his love of literature did not fail. Footnote. It is truly wonderful to consider the extent and constancy of Johnson's literary ardor, notwithstanding the melancholy which clouded and embittered his existence. Besides the numerous and various works which he executed, he had at different times formed schemes of a great many more, of which the following catalogue was given by him to Mr. Langton, and by that gentleman presented to his Majesty. Divinity, a small book of precepts and directions for piety, the hint taken from the directions in Morton's Exercise. Philosophy, history, and literature in general. History of criticism as it relates to judging of authors from Aristotle to the present age. An account of the rise and improvements of that art, of the different opinions of authors ancient and modern. Translation of the history of Herodian. New edition of Fairfax's translation of Tasso, with notes, glossary, etc. Chaucer, a new edition of him from manuscripts and old editions, with various readings, conjectures, remarks on his language, and the changes it had undergone from the earliest times to his age, and from his to the present, with notes explanatory of customs, etc., and references to Boccace and other authors from whom he has borrowed, with an account of the liberties he has taken in telling the stories, his life, and an exact etymological glossary. Aristotle's Rhetoric, a translation of it into English. A collection of letters, translated from the modern writers, with some account of the several authors. Oldham's Poems, with notes, historical and critical. Roscommon's Poems, with notes. Lives of the Philosophers, written with a polite air, in such a manner as may divert as well as instruct. History of the Heathen Mythology, with an explication of the fables, both allegorical and historical, with references to the poets. History of the State of Venice, in a compendious manner. Aristotle's Ethics, an English translation of them, with notes. Geographical Dictionary, from the French. Heracles upon Pythagoras, translated into English, perhaps with notes. This is done by Norris. A book of letters upon all kinds of subjects. Claudian, a new edition of his work, Cum Notis Variorum, in the manner of Burman. Tully's Tusculan Questions, a translation of them. Tully's De Natura Deorum, a translation of those books. Benzo's New History of the World, to be translated. Machiavel's History of Florence, to be translated. History of the Revival of Learning in Europe, containing an account of whatever contributed to the restoration of literature, such as controversies, printing, the destruction of the Greek Empire, the encouragement of great men, with the lives of the most eminent patrons and most eminent early professors of all kinds of learning in different countries. A body of chronology, in verse with historical notes. A table of spectators, tattlers, and guardians, distinguished by figures into 6 degrees of value, with notes, giving the reasons of preference or degradation. A collection of letters from English authors, with a preface giving some account of the writers, with reasons for selection, and criticism upon styles, remarks on each letter, if needful. A collection of proverbs from various languages, January 6, 53. A Dictionary to the Common Prayer, in imitation of Calumet's Dictionary of the Bible, March, 52. A collection of stories and examples like those of Valerius Maximus, January 10, 53. From Aelian, a volume of select stories, perhaps from others, January 28, 53. Collection of travels, voyages, adventures, and descriptions of countries. Dictionary of Ancient History and Mythology. Treatise on the Study of Polite Literature, containing the history of learning, directions for editions, commentaries, etc. Maxims, characters, and sentiments, after the manner of Bruyère, collected out of ancient authors, particularly the Greek, with apophthegms. Classical miscellanies, select translations from ancient Greek and Latin authors. Lives of illustrious persons, as well as of the active as the learned, in imitation of Plutarch. Judgment of the learned upon English authors. Poetical Dictionary of the English tongue. Considerations upon the present state of London. Collection of epigrams, with notes and observations. Observations on the English language, relating to words, phrases, and modes of speech. Minutiae Literariae, miscellaneous reflections, criticisms, emendations, notes. History of the Constitution. Comparison of philosophical and Christian morality by sentences collected from the moralists and fathers. Poetry and works of imagination. Hymn to Ignorance. The Palace of Sloth, a vision. Colothus, to be translated. Prejudice, a poetical essay. The Palace of Nonsense, a vision. Johnson's extraordinary facility of composition, when he shook off his constitutional indolence, and resolutely sat down to write, is admirably described by Mr. Courtenay in his poetical review, which I have several times quoted. While through life's maze he sent a piercing view, his mind expansive to the object grew. With various stores of erudition fraught, the lively image, the deep searching thought, slept in repose, but when the moment pressed, the bright idea stood at once confessed. Instant his genius sped its vigorous rays, and o'er the lettered world diffused a blaze. As wombed with fire the cloud electric flies, and calmly o'er the horizon seems to rise. Touched by the pointed steel the lightning flows, and all the expanse with rich effulgence glows. We shall in vain endeavor to know with exact precision every production of Johnson's pen. He owned to me that he had written about 40 sermons, but as I understood that he had given or sold them to different persons, who were to preach them as their own, he did not consider himself at liberty to acknowledge them. Would those who were thus aided by him, who are still alive, and the friends of those who are dead, fairly inform the world, it would be obligingly gratifying a reasonable curiosity, to which there should, I think, now be no objection. 2 volumes of them, published since his death, are sufficiently ascertained. I have before me in his handwriting a fragment of 20 quarto leaves of a translation into English of Sallust de Bella Catilinario. When it was done I have no notion, but it seems to have no very superior merit to mark it as his. Beside the publications heretofore mentioned, I am satisfied from internal evidence to admit also as genuine the following, which, notwithstanding all my chronological care, escaped me in the course of this work. Considerations on the case of Dr. Trapp's Sermons, published in 1739 in the Gentleman's Magazine. These considerations were published, not in 1739, but in 1787. It is a very ingenious defence of the right of abridging an author's work without being held as infringing his property. This is one of the nicest questions in the law of literature, and I cannot help thinking that the indulgence of abridging is often exceedingly injurious to authors and booksellers, and should in very few cases be permitted. At any rate, to prevent difficult and uncertain discussion, and give an absolute security to authors in the property of their labours, no abridgment whatever should be permitted till after the expiration of such a number of years as the legislature may be pleased to fix. But though it has been confidently ascribed to him, I cannot allow that he wrote a dedication to both houses of Parliament of a book entitled The Evangelical History Harmonized. He was no croaker, no declaimer against the times. He would not have written, that we are fallen upon an age in which corruption is not barely universal, is universally confessed. Nor, rapine preys on the public without opposition, and perjury betrays it without inquiry. Nor would he, to excite a speedy reformation, have conjured up such phantoms of terror as these: a few years longer, and perhaps all endeavors will be in vain. We may be swallowed by an earthquake. We may be delivered to our enemies. This is not Johnsonian. There are indeed in this dedication several sentences constructed upon the model of those of Johnson, but the imitation of the form, without the spirit of his style, has been so general, that this of itself is not sufficient evidence. Even our newspaper writers aspire to it. In an account of the funeral of Edwin the comedian, in the diary of November 9th, 1790, that son of drollery is thus described: a man who had so often cheered the sullenness of vacancy, and suspended the approaches of sorrow. And in the Dublin Evening Post, August 16th, 1791, there is the following paragraph: "It is a singular circumstance that in a city like this, containing 200,000 people, there are 3 months in the year during which no place of public amusement is open. Long vacation is here a vacation from pleasure, as well as business, nor is there any mode of passing the listless evenings of declining summer, but in the riots of a tavern, or the stupidity of a coffee house." I have not thought it necessary to specify every copy of verses written by Johnson, it being my intention to publish an authentic edition of all his poetry, with notes. Boswell. This catalogue, as Mr. Boswell calls it, is by Dr. Johnson, entitled Designs. It seems from the hand that it was written early in life. From the marginal dates it appears that some portions were added in 1752 and 53. Croker. End of footnote. A very few days before his death he transmitted to his friend Mr. John Nichols a list of the authors of the Universal History, mentioning their several shares in that work. It has, according to his direction, been deposited in the British Museum, and is printed in the Gentleman's Magazine for December, 1784. During his sleepless nights he amused himself by translating into Latin verse from the Greek many of the epigrams in the Anthologica. Footnote: on April 19th of this year he wrote: "When I lay sleepless, I used to drive the night long by turning Greek epigrams into Latin. I know not if I have not turned 100. 45 years earlier he described how Boerhaave, when he lay whole days and nights without sleep, found no method of diverting his thought so effectual as meditation upon his studies, and often relieved and mitigated the sense of his torments by the recollection of what he had read, and by reviewing those stores of knowledge which he had reposited in his memory." End footnote. These translations, with some other poems by him in Latin, he gave to his friend Mr. Langton, who, having added a few notes, sold them to the booksellers for a small sum, to be given to some of Johnson's relations, which was accordingly done, and they are printed in the collection of his works. A very erroneous notion has circulated as to Johnson's deficiency in the knowledge of the Greek language, partly owing to the modesty with which, from knowing how much there was to be learnt, he used to mention his own comparative acquisitions. When Mr. Cumberland [Footnote: Mr. Cumberland assures me that he was always treated with great courtesy by Dr. Johnson, who, in his letters to Mrs. Thrale, thus speaks of that learned, ingenious, and accomplished gentleman: "The want of company is not an inconvenience, but Mr. Cumberland is a million." Boswell. Northcote, according to Hazlitt, said that Johnson and his friends never admitted C. Cumberland as one of the set. Sir Joshua did not invite him to dinner. If he had been in the room, Goldsmith would have flown out of it as if a dragon had been there. I remember Garrick once saying, "Damn his dishclout face, his plays would never do, if it were not for my patching them up and acting in them." Talked to him of the Greek fragments which are so well illustrated in the Observer, and of the Greek dramatists in general, he candidly acknowledged his insufficiency in that particular branch of Greek literature. Yet it may be said, that though not a great, he was a good Greek scholar. Dr. Charles Burney the younger, who is universally acknowledged by the best judges to be one of the few men of this age who were very eminent for their skill in that noble language, Dr. Parr said, "There are 3 great Grecians in England. Porson is the first, Burney the third, and who is the second I need not tell." Has assured me that Johnson could give a Greek word for almost every English one, and that although not sufficiently conversant in the niceties of the language, he upon some occasions discovered, even in these, a considerable degree of critical acumen. Mr. Dalzell, professor of Greek at Edinburgh, whose skill in it is unquestionable, mentioned to me in very liberal terms the impression which was made upon him by Johnson in a conversation which they had in London concerning that language. As Johnson therefore was undoubtedly one of the first Latin scholars in modern times, let us not deny to his fame some additional splendor from Greek. Dr. Johnson said Parr was an admirable scholar. The classical scholar was forgotten in the great original contributor to the literature of his country. Upon his correct and profound knowledge of the Latin language, he wrote, I have always spoken with unusual zeal and unusual confidence. Mrs. Piazzi recounts a triumph gained by Johnson in a talk on Greek literature. I shall now fulfill my promise of exhibiting specimens of various sorts of imitation of Johnson's style. In the Transactions of the Royal Irish Academy, 1787, there is an essay on the style of Dr. Samuel Johnson, by the Rev. Robert Burroughs, whose respect for the great object of his criticism is thus evinced in the concluding paragraph. We must smile at a little inaccuracy of metaphor in the preface to the Transactions, which is written by Mr. Burroughs. The critic of the style of Johnson having, with a just zeal for literature, observed that the whole nation are called on to exert themselves, afterwards says, "They are called on by every tie which can have a laudable influence on the heart of men." Boswell. I have singled him out from the whole body of English writers, because his universally acknowledged beauties would be most apt to induce imitation; and I have treated rather on his faults than his perfections, because an essay might comprise all the observations I could make upon his faults, while volumes could not be sufficient for a treatise on his perfections. Mr. Burroughs has analyzed the composition of Johnson, and pointed out its peculiarities with much acuteness, and I would recommend a careful perusal of his essay to those, who, being captivated by the union of perspicuity and splendor which the writings of Johnson could contain, without having a sufficient portion of his vigor of mind, may be in danger of becoming bad copyists of his manner. I, however, cannot but observe, and I observe it to his credit, that this learned gentleman has himself caught no mean degree of the expansion and harmony which, independent of all other circumstances, characterize the sentences of Johnson. Thus, in the preface to the volume in which his essay appears, we find: "If it be said that in societies of this sort too much attention is frequently bestowed on subjects barren and speculative, it may be answered that no one science is so little connected with the rest, as not to afford many principles whose use may extend considerably beyond the science to which they primarily belong, and that no proposition is so purely theoretical as to be totally incapable of being applied to practical purposes. There is no apparent connection between duration and the cycloidal arch, the properties of which, duly attended to, have furnished us with our best regulated methods of measuring time; and he who has made himself master of the nature and affections of the logarithmic curve is not aware that he has advanced considerably towards ascertaining the proportionable density of the air at its various distances from the surface of the earth." The ludicrous imitators of Johnson's style are innumerable. Their general method is to accumulate hard words without considering that, although he was fond of introducing them occasionally, there is not a single sentence in all his writings where they are crowded together, as in the first verse of the following imagery ode to him by Mrs. Thrale, which appeared in the newspapers: Servicial coctors viduate dame, opinest thou this gigantic frame, procumbing at thy shrine, shall, cantonated by thy charms, a captive in thine ambient arms, perennially be thine. Johnson. Johnson's wishing to unite himself with this rich widow was much talked of, but I believe without foundation. The report, however, gave occasion to a poem, not without characteristical merit, entitled Ode to Mrs. Thrale, by Samuel Johnson, LL.D., on their supposed approaching nuptials, printed for Mr. Falder in Bond Street. I shall quote as a specimen the first 3 stanzas. If e'er my fingers touch the lyre, in satin fierce, in pleasure gay, shall not my Thralia's smiles inspire? Shall Sam refuse the sportive lay? My dearest lady, view your slave, behold him as your very scrub, eager to write as author grave, or govern well the brewing tub. To rich felicity thus raised, my bosom glows with amorous fire. Porter no longer shall be praised, 'tis I myself am Thrale's entire. This, and 1,000 other such attempts, are totally unlike the original, which the writers imagined they were turning into a ridicule. There is not similarity enough for burlesque, or even for caricature. Section 45
of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4, by James Boswell, Section 45. Mr. Coleman, in his Prose on Several Occasions, has a letter from Lexiphanes, containing proposals for a glossary of vocabulary of the vulgar tongue, intended as a supplement to a larger dictionary. Footnote: higgledy-piggledy, conglomeration and confusion; hodgepodge, a culinary mixture of heterogeneous ingredients applied metaphorically to all discordant combinations; tit for tat, adequate retaliation; shilly-shally, hesitation and irresolution; fee-fo-fum, gigantic intonations; rigmarole, discourse incoherent and rhapsodical; crinkum-crankum, lines of irregularity and involution; ding-dong, tintinnabulary chimes, used metaphorically to signify dispatch and vehemence. Boswell. It is evidently meant as a sportive sally of ridicule on Johnson, whose style is thus imitated without being grossly overcharged. It is easy to foresee that the idle and illiterate will complain that I have increased their labours by endeavouring to diminish them, and that I have explained what is more easy by what is more difficult, ignotum per ignatius. I expect, on the other hand, the liberal acknowledgments of the learned. He who is buried in scholastic retirement, secluded from the assemblies of the gay, and remote from the circles of the polite, will at once comprehend the definitions, and be grateful for such a seasonable and necessary elucidation of his mother tongue. Annexed to this letter is a short specimen of the work, thrown together in a vague and desultory manner, not even adhering to alphabetical concatenation. Footnote: in all the editions that I have examined, the sentence in the text beginning with annexed and ending with concatenation is printed as if it were Boswell's. It is a quotation from Volume 2, page 3 of Coleman's book. End of footnote. The serious imitators of Johnson's style, whether intentionally or by the imperceptible effect of its strength and animation, are, as I have already occasion to observe, so many, that I might introduce quotations from a numerous body of writers in our language since he appeared in the literary world. I shall point out only the following. William Robertson, Doctor of Divinity. In other parts of the globe, man in his rudest state appears as lord of the creation, giving law to various tribes of animals which he has tamed and reduced to subjection. The Tartar follows his prey on the horse which he has reared, or tends his numerous herds, which furnish him both with food and clothing. The Arab has rendered the camel docile, and avails himself of its persevering strength. The Laplander has formed the reindeer to be subservient to his will, and even the people of Kamschatka have trained their dogs to labour. This command over the inferior creatures is one of the noblest prerogatives of man, and among the greatest efforts of his wisdom and power. Without this, his dominion is incomplete. He is a monarch who has no subjects, a master without servants, and must perform every operation by the strength of his own arm. Edward Gibbon, Esquire. Footnote: Gibbon thus writes of his own style: "The style of an author should be the image of his mind, but the choice and command of language is the fruit of exercise. Many experiments were made before I could hit the middle tone between a dull chronicle and a rhetorical declamation. 3 times did I compose the first chapter, and twice the second and third, before I was tolerably satisfied with their effect." End of footnote. Of all our passions and appetites, the love of power is of the most imperious and unsociable nature, since the pride of one man requires the submission of the multitude. In the tumult of civil discord, the laws of society lose their force, and their place is seldom supplied by those of humanity. The ardour of contention, the pride of victory, the despair of success, the memory of past injuries, and the fear of future dangers, all contribute to inflame the mind and to silence the voice of pity. Miss Burney, footnote: Macaulay gives a yet better example of her Johnsonian style, though, as I have shown, he is wrong in saying that Johnson's hand can be seen. End of footnote. My family, mistaking ambition for honour and rank for dignity, have long planned a splendid connection for me, to which, though my invariable repugnance has stopped any advances, their wishes and their views immovably adhere. I am but too certain they will now listen to no other. I dread, therefore, to make a trial where I despair of success. I know not how to risk a prayer with those who may silence me by a command. Reverend Mr. Nares. Footnote: The passage which I quote is taken from that gentleman's Elements of Autobiography, containing a distinct view of the whole analogy of the English language, so far as relates to pronunciation, accent, and quantity. London, 1784. I beg leave to offer my particular acknowledgments to the author of a work of uncommon merit and great utility. I know no book which contains in the same compass more learning, polite literature, sound sense, accuracy of arrangement, and perspicuity of expression. Boswell. End of footnote. In an enlightened and improving age, much perhaps is not to be apprehended from the inroads of mere caprice. At such a period it will generally be perceived that needless irregularity is the worst of all deformities, and that nothing is so truly elegant in language as the simplicity of unviolated analogy. Rules will, therefore, be observed so far as they are known and acknowledged, but at the same time the desire of improvement having been once excited will not remain inactive, and its efforts, unless assisted by knowledge as much as they are prompted by zeal, will not unfrequently be found pernicious, so that the very persons whose intention it is to perfect the instrument of reason will deprave and disorder it unknowingly. At such a time then it becomes peculiarly necessary that the analogy of language should be fully examined and understood, that its rules should be carefully laid down, and that it should be clearly known how much it contains which, being already right, should be defended from change and violation, how much it has that demands amendment, and how much that, for fear of greater inconveniencies, must perhaps be left unaltered, though irregular. A distinguished author in The Mirror, a periodical paper published at Edinburgh, has imitated Johnson very closely. Footnote: that collection was presented to Dr. Johnson, I believe, by its authors, and I heard him speak very well of it. Boswell. The Mirror was published in 1779–80. By 1793 it reached its 9th edition. For an account of it, see Appendix D to Forbes's Beattie. Henry Mackenzie, the author of The Man of Feeling, was the chief contributor, as well as the conductor of the paper. He is given as the author of No. 16 in Lynam's edition, page 1. End of footnote. Thus, in No. 16, the effects of the return of spring have been frequently remarked as well in relation to the human mind as to the animal and vegetable world. The reviving power of this season has been traced from the fields to the herds that inhabit them, and from the lower classes of beings up to man. Gladness and joy are described as prevailing through universal nature, animating the low of the cattle, the carol of the birds, and the pipe of the shepherd. The Reverend Dr. Knox, master of Tunbridge School, footnote: the name of Vicesimus Knox is now scarcely known, yet so late as 1824 his collected works were published in 7 octavo volumes. The editor says of his essays, "In no department of belles lettres has any publication, excepting the Spectator, been so extensively circulated. It has been translated into most of the European languages." End of footnote. Appears to have the imitari avio of Johnson's style perpetually in his mind, and to his assiduous, though not servile, study of it we may partly ascribe the extensive popularity of his writings. Footnote: it were to be wished that he had imitated that great man in every respect, and had not followed the example of Dr. Adam Smith in ungraciously attacking his venerable alma mater, Oxford. It must, however, be observed that he is much less to blame than Smith. He only objects to certain particulars, Smith to the whole institution, though indebted for much of his learning to an exhibition which he enjoyed for many years at Balliol College. Neither of them, however, will do any hurt to the noblest university in the world. While I animadvert on what appears to me exceptionable in some of the works of Dr. Knox, I cannot refuse due praise to others of his productions, particularly his sermons, and to the spirit with which he maintains against presumptuous heretics the consolatory doctrines peculiar to the Christian revelation. This he has done in a manner equally strenuous and conciliating. Neither ought I to omit mentioning a remarkable instance of his candour. Notwithstanding the wide difference of our opinions upon the important subject of university education, in a letter to me concerning this work, he thus expresses himself: "I thank you for the very great entertainment your Life of Johnson gives me. It is a most valuable work. Yours is a new species of biography. Happy for Johnson that he had so able a recorder of his wit and wisdom." Boswell. End of footnote. In his essays, Moral and Literary, No. 3, we find the following passage: "The polish of external grace may indeed be deferred till the approach of manhood. When solidity is obtained by pursuing the modes prescribed by our forefathers, then may the file be used. The firm substance will bear attrition, and the lustre then acquired will be durable." There is, however, one in No. 11, which is blown up into such timidity as to be truly ludicrous. The writer means to tell us that members of Parliament who have run in debt by extravagance will sell their votes to avoid an arrest, which he thus expresses. Footnote: Dr. Knox, in his moral and literary abstraction, may be excused for not knowing the political regulations of his country. No senator can be in the hands of a bailiff. Boswell. End of footnote. They who build houses and collect costly pictures and furniture with the money of an honest artisan or mechanic will be very glad of emancipation from the hands of a bailiff by a sale of their senatorial suffrage. But I think the most perfect imitation of Johnson is a professed one, entitled A Criticism on Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard, said to be written by Mr. Young, Professor of Greek at Glasgow, and of which let him have the credit, unless a better title can be shown. It has not only the peculiarities of Johnson's style, but that very species of literary discussion and illustration for which he was eminent. Having already quoted so much from others, I shall refer the curious to this performance with an assurance of much entertainment. Footnote. It is entitled A Continuation of Dr. J. Blank's Criticism on the Poems of Gray. The following is perhaps the best passage. On some fine evening, Gray had seen the moon shining on a tower such as is here described. An owl might be seen peeping out from the ivy with which it was clad. Of the observer, the station might be such that the owl, now emerged from the mantling, presented itself to his eye in profile, skirting with the moon's limb. All this is well. The perspective is striking and the picture well defined. But the poet was not contented. He felt a desire to enlarge it, and in executing his purpose gave it accumulation without improvement. The idea of the owl's complaining is an artificial one, and the views on which it proceeds absurd. Gray should have seen that it but ill befitted the bird of wisdom to complain to the moon of an intrusion which the moon could no more help than herself. Johnson wrote of this book, "I know little of it, for though it was sent me, I never cut the leaves open. I had a letter with it, representing it to me as my own work. In such an account to the public there may be humour, but to myself it was neither serious nor comical. I suspect the writer to be wrong-headed. I was told," wrote Walpole, "it would divert me, that it seems to criticise Gray, but really laughs at Johnson. I sent for it and skimmed it over, but am not at all clear what it means. No recommendation of anything. I rather think the author wishes to be taken by Gray's admirers for a ridiculer of Johnson, and by the latter's for a censurer of Gray. The cleverest parody of the Doctor's style of criticism," wrote Sir Walter Scott, "is by John Young of Glasgow, and is very capital." End of footnote. Yet whatever merit there may be in any imitations of Johnson's style, every good judge must see that they are obviously different from the original, for all of them are either deficient in its force, or overloaded with its peculiarities, and the powerful sentiment to which it is suited is not to be found. Johnson's affection for his departed relations seemed to grow warmer as he approached nearer to the time when he might hope to see them again. It probably appeared to him that he should upbraid himself with unkind inattention, were he to leave the world without having paid a tribute of respect to their memory. To Mr. Green, apothecary at Lichfield. Dear Sir, I have enclosed the epitaph for my father, mother, and brother, to be all engraved on the large size, and laid in the middle aisle in St. Michael's Church, which I request the clergymen and churchwardens to permit. Footnote: Hic situs est Michael Johnson. Vir impavidus, constans, animosus, periculorum imemo, laborum patientissimus, fiducia Christiana fortis fervidusque, pater familias aprimes trenus, bibliopola ad modem peritus, mente et librus et negotiis exculta, animo ita firmo ut rebus adversus dui conflictatus nec sibi nec suis depuerit, lingua sic temperata, ut ei nihil quod ores vel pias vel castas laesiset, aut dolo vel voluptas unquam expresserit, natus cobleae in agro debiensi, annum 1656, obiit 1731. Apposita est Sara coniux, antiqua fodorum gente oriunda, quam domis sedulum foris paucus notam, nulli malestam, mentis acumine et judiciis subtilitate praecelentum, alius multum sibi parum indulgentem, aetenitate semper attentam, omni feri virtutis nomen commendavit, nata Notoniae regis in agro Vavicensie, anno 1669, obiit 1759. Cum Nathanaele, illorum filio, qui natus 1712, cum vires et animi et corporis multo pollicerentur, anno 1730, vitam brevam pia morte finivit. End of footnote. The first care must be to find the exact place of interment, that the stone may protect the bodies. Footnote. Hawkins says that he asks that the stone over his own grave might be so placed as to protect his body from injury. Harwood says that the stone in St. Michael's was removed in 1796 when the church was paved. A fresh one with the old inscriptions was placed in the church on the 100th anniversary of Johnson's death by Robert Thorpe, Esquire, of Buxton Road House, Macclesfield. The Reverend James Sargentson, rector of St. Michael's, suggests to me that the first stone was never set up. It is, he says, unlikely that such a memorial within a dozen years was treated so unworthily. Moreover, in 1841 and again in 1883, during reparations of the church, a very careful search was made for it, but without result. There may have been, he thinks, some difficulty in finding the exact place of interment. The matter may have stood over till it was forgotten, and the mason, whose receipted bill shows that he was paid for the stone, may have used it for some other purpose. End of footnote. Then let the stone be deep, massy, and hard, and do not let the difference of 10 pounds or more defeat our purpose. I have enclosed 10 pounds, and Mrs. Porter will pay you 10 more, which I gave her for the same purpose. What more is wanted shall be sent, and I beg that all possible haste may be made, for I wish to have it done while I am yet alive. Let me know, dear sir, that you receive this. I am, sir, your most humble servant, Samuel Johnson, December 2nd, 1784. To Mrs. Lucy Porter, in Lichfield. Dear Madam, I am very ill, and desire your prayers. I have sent Mr. Green the epitaph, and a power to call on you for 10 pounds. I laid this summer a stone over Tetty, in the chapel of Bromley in Kent. The inscription is in Latin, of which this is the English. In square brackets, here a translation. That this is done, I thought it fit that you should know. What care will be taken of us, who can tell? May God pardon and bless us for Jesus Christ's sake. I am, etc., Samuel Johnson, December 2nd, 1784. Footnote. He would also, says Hawkins, have written in Latin verse an epitaph for Mr. Garrick, but found himself unequal to the task of original poetic composition in that language. End of footnote. My readers are now at last to behold Samuel Johnson preparing himself for that doom from which the most exalted powers afford no exemption to man. Footnote. In his Life of Browne, Johnson wrote, "The time will come to every human being when it must be known how well he can bear to die, and it has appeared that our author's fortitude did not desert him in the great hour of trial." End of footnote. Death had always been to him an object of terror, so that, though by no means happy, he still clung to life with an eagerness at which many have wondered. At any time when he was ill, he was very much pleased to be told that he looked better. An ingenious member of the Wheelian Club, footnote, a club in London founded by the learned and ingenious physician, Dr. Ashe, in honour of whose name it was called Wheelian, from the Greek Humilius, though it was warmly contended, and even put to a vote, that it should have the more obvious appellation of Fraxinian, from the Latin, Boswell. This club, founded in 1788, met at the Blenheim Tavern, Bond Street. Reynolds, Boswell, Burney, and Wyndham were members. Greek Eumelias means armed with good ashen spear. End of footnote. Informs me that upon one occasion, when he said to him that he saw health returning to his cheek, Johnson seized him by the hand and exclaimed, "Sir, you are one of the kindest friends I ever had." His own state of his views of futurity will appear truly rational, and may perhaps impress the unthinking with seriousness. "You know," says he, "I never thought confidence with respect to futurity any part of the character of a brave, a wise, or a good man. Bravery has no place where it can avail nothing. Wisdom impresses strongly the consciousness of those faults of which it is perhaps itself an aggravation, and goodness, always wishing to be better, and imputing every deficiency to criminal negligence and every fault to voluntary corruption, never dares to suppose the condition of forgiveness fulfilled, nor what is wanting in the crime supplied by penitence. This is the state of the best. But what must be the condition of him whose heart will not suffer him to rank himself among the best or among the good? Such must be his dread of the approaching trial as will leave him little attention to the opinion of those whom he is leaving for ever, and the serenity that is not felt can be no virtue to feign." His great fear of death, and the strange dark manner in which Sir John Hawkins imparts the uneasiness which he expressed on account of offences with which he charged himself, may give occasion to injurious suspicions, as if there had been something of more than ordinary criminality weighing upon his conscience. On that account, therefore, as well as from the regard to truth which he inculcated, I am to mention, with all possible respect and delicacy, however, that his conduct after he came to London, and had associated with Savage and others, was not so strictly virtuous in one respect as when he was a younger man. It was well known that his amorous inclinations were uncommonly strong and impetuous. He owned to many of his friends that he used to take women of the town to taverns, and hear them relate their history. In short, it must not be concealed that, like many other good and pious men, among whom we may place the Apostle Paul upon his own authority, Johnson was not free from propensities which were ever warring against the law of his mind, and that in his combats with them he was sometimes overcome. Footnote: Johnson's passions, wrote Reynolds, were like those of other men. The difference only lay in his keeping a stricter watch over himself. In petty circumstances this (his) wayward disposition appeared, but in greater things he thought it worth while to summon his recollection, and to be always on his guard. (To them that loved him not, as rough as winter; to those who sought his love, as mild as summer.) Many instances will readily occur to those who knew him intimately of the guard which he endeavoured always to keep over himself. Here let the profane and licentious pause. Let them not thoughtlessly say that Johnson was an hypocrite, or that his principles were not firm because his practice was not uniformly conformable to what he professed. Let the question be considered independent of moral and religious association, and no man will deny that thousands, in many instances, act against conviction. Is a prodigal, for example, an hypocrite, when he owns he is satisfied that his extravagance will bring him to ruin and misery? We are sure he believes it, but immediate inclination, strengthened by indulgence, prevails over that belief in influencing his conduct. Why then shall credit be refused to the sincerity of those who acknowledge their persuasion of moral and religious duty, yet sometimes fail of living as it requires? I heard Dr. Johnson once observe, "There is something noble in publishing truth, though it condemns oneself." On the same subject, in his letter to Mrs. Thrale, dated November 29th, 1783, he makes the following just observation: "Life, to be worthy of a rational being, must be always in progression. We must always purpose to do more or better than in time past. The mind is enlarged and elevated by mere purposes, though they end as they began (in the original begin) by airy contemplation. We compare and judge, though we do not practice." Boswell. And one who said in his presence he had no notion of people being in earnest in their good professions, whose practice was not suitable to them, was thus reprimanded by him: "Sir, are you so grossly ignorant of human nature as not to know that a man may be very sincere in good principles without having good practice?" Section 45. Section 46 of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4, by James Boswell, Section 46. But let no man encourage or soothe himself in presumptuous sin, from knowing that Johnson was sometimes hurried into indulgences which he thought criminal. I have exhibited this circumstance as a shade in so great a character, both from my sacred love of truth, and to show that he was not so weakly scrupulous as he has been represented by those who imagine that the sins of which a deep sense was upon his mind were merely such little venial trifles as pouring milk into his tea on Good Friday. His understanding will be defended by my statement, if his consistency of conduct be in some degree impaired. But what wise man would, for momentary gratifications, deliberately subject himself to suffer such uneasiness as we find was experienced by Johnson in reviewing his conduct as compared with his notion of the ethics of the Gospel? Let the following passages be kept in remembrance. O God, giver and preserver of all life, by whose power I was created, and by whose providence I am sustained, look down upon me with tenderness and mercy. Grant that I may not have been created to be finally destroyed, that I may not be preserved to add wickedness to wickedness. O Lord, let me not sink into total depravity. Look down upon me and rescue me at last from the captivity of sin. Almighty and most merciful Father, who hast continued my life from year to year, grant that by longer life I may become less desirous of sinful pleasures and more careful of eternal happiness. Let not my years be multiplied to increase my guilt, but as my age advances, let me become more pure in my thoughts, more regular in my desires, and more obedient to thy laws. Forgive, O merciful Lord, whatever I have done contrary to thy laws. Give me such a sense of my wickedness as may produce true contrition and effectual repentance, so that when I shall be called into another state, I may be received among the sinners to whom sorrow and reformation have obtained pardon. For Jesus Christ's sake. Amen. Such was the distress of mind, such the penitence of Johnson in his hours of privacy, and in his devout approaches to his Maker. His sincerity therefore must appear to every candid mind unquestionable. It is of essential consequence to keep in view that there was in this excellent man's conduct no false principle of commutation, no deliberate indulgence in sin in consideration of a counterbalance of duty. His offending and his repenting were distinct and separate. Footnote: Dr. Johnson related with very earnest approbation a story of a gentleman who, in an impulse of passion, overcame the virtue of a young woman. When she said to him, "I am afraid we have done wrong," he answered, "Yes, we have done wrong, for I would not debauch her mind." Boswell. End of footnote. And when we consider his almost unexampled attention to truth, his inflexible integrity, his constant piety, who will dare to cast a stone at him? Besides, let it never be forgotten that he cannot be charged with any offence indicating badness of heart, anything dishonest, base, or malignant; that, on the contrary, he was charitable in an extraordinary degree, so that even in one of his own rigid judgments of himself, Easter Eve, 1781, while he says, "I have corrected no external habits," he is obliged to own, "I hope that since my last communion I have advanced by pious reflections in my submission to God and my benevolence to man." I am conscious that this is the most difficult and dangerous part of my biographical work, and I cannot but be very anxious concerning it. I trust that I have got through it, preserving at once my regard to truth, to my friend, and to the interests of virtue and religion, nor can I apprehend that more harm can ensue from the knowledge of the irregularity of Johnson, guarded as I have stated it, than from knowing that Addison and Parnell were intemperate in the use of wine, which he himself, in his lives of those celebrated writers and pious men, has not forborne to record. It is not my intention to give a very minute detail of the particulars of Johnson's remaining days, of whom it was now evident that the crisis was fast approaching, when he must die like men and fall like one of the princes. Footnote: Boswell, on February 10, 1791, describing to Malone the progress of his book, says, "I have now before me page 488 in print, and 923 pages of the copy manuscript only is exhausted, and there remains 80 besides the death." as to which I shall be concise, though solemn. Pray, how shall I wind up? Shall I give the character from my tour, somewhat enlarged? Mr. Croker is clearly in error in saying that Mr. Boswell's absence and the jealousy between him and some of Johnson's other friends prevented his being able to give the particulars which he, Mr. Croker, has supplied in the appendix. In this appendix is Mr. Wheal's narrative, which Boswell had seen and used. End of footnote. Yet it will be instructive, as well as gratifying to the curiosity of my readers, to record a few circumstances, on the authenticity of which they may perfectly rely, as I have been at the utmost pains to obtain an accurate account of his last illness from the best authority. Dr. Heberden, footnote, on being asked in his last illness what physician he had sent for, Dr. Heberden, replied he, ultimus Romanorum, the last of the learned physicians. End of footnote. Dr. Brocklesby, Dr. Warren, footnote. Mr. Green related that when some of Johnson's friends desired that Dr. Warren should be called in, he said they might call in whom they pleased. And when Warren was called, at his going away, Johnson said, "You have come in at the 11th hour, but you shall be paid the same with your fellow labourers. Francis, put into Dr. Warren's coach a copy of the English poets." Croker. Dr. Warren, 10 years later, attended Boswell in his last illness. He was the great-grandfather of Colonel Sir Charles Warren, GCMG, FRS, Chief Commissioner of Police. End of footnote. And Dr. Butter, physicians, generously attended him without accepting any fees, as did Mr. Cruikshank, surgeon. And all that could be done from professional skill and ability was tried to prolong a life so truly valuable. He himself, indeed, having, on account of his very bad constitution, been perpetually applying himself to medical inquiries, united his own efforts with those of the gentlemen who attended him, and imagining that the dropsical collection of water which oppressed him might be drawn off by making incisions in his body, he, with his usual resolute defiance of pain, cut deep, when he thought that his surgeon had done it too tenderly. Footnote. This bold experiment Sir John Hawkins has related in such a manner as to suggest a charge against Johnson of intentionally hastening his end, a charge so very inconsistent with his character in every respect, that it is injurious even to refute it, as Sir John has thought it necessary to do. It is evident that what Johnson did in hopes of relief indicated an extraordinary eagerness to retard his dissolution. Boswell. Murphy says that for many years, when Johnson was not disposed to enter into the conversation going forward, whoever sat near his chair might hear him repeating from Shakespeare, Measure for Measure, Act 3, Scene 1, "Ah, but to die, and go we know not where, to lie in cold obstruction and to rot, this sensible warm motion to become a kneaded clot, and the delighted spirit to bathe in fiery floods." And from Milton, Paradise Lost, Book 2, line 146, "Who would lose, though full of pain, this intellectual being?" Johnson, the year before, at a time when he thought that he must submit to the surgeon's knife, wrote to Mrs. Thrale, "You would not have me, for fear of pain, perish in putrescence. I shall, I hope, with trust in eternal mercy, lay hold of the possibility of life which yet remains." Hawkins records that one day Johnson said to his doctor, "How many men in a year die through the timidity of those whom they consult for health? I want length of life, and you fear giving me pain, which I care not for." Another day, When Mr. Cruikshank scarified his leg, he cried out, "Deeper, deeper! I will abide the consequence. You are afraid of your reputation, but that is nothing to me." To those about him he said, "You all pretend to love me, but you do not love me so well as I myself do." Wyndham says that he reproached Heberden with being timidorum timidissimus. Throughout he acted up to what he had said. "I will be conquered. I will not capitulate." End of footnote. About 8 or 10 days before his death, when Dr. Brocklesby paid him his morning visit, he seemed very low and desponding, and said, "I have been as a dying man all night." He then emphatically broke out in the words of Shakespeare, "Canst thou not minister to a mind diseased, pluck from the memory a rooted sorrow, raze out the written troubles of the brain, and with some sweet oblivious antidote cleanse the stuffed bosom of that perilous stuff which weighs upon the heart?" To which Dr. Brocklesby readily answered, from the same great poet, "Therein the patient must minister to himself." Johnson expressed himself much satisfied with the application. On another day after this, when talking on the subject of prayer, Dr. Brocklesby repeated from Juvenal, "Orandum est ut sit mens sana in corpore sano," and so on to the end of the 10th satire. But in running it quickly over, he happened in the line, "Qui spatium vitae extremum intermunera ponat," to pronounce primum for extremum, at which Johnson's critical ear instantly took offence, and discoursing vehemently on the unmetrical effect of such a lapse, he showed himself as full as ever of the spirit of the grammarian. Footnote: Johnson, 3 days after his stroke of palsy, wrote, "When I waked, I found Dr. Brocklesby sitting by me. He fell to repeating Juvenal's 9th satire, but I let him see that the province was mine." End of footnote. Having no near relations, it had been for some time Johnson's intention to make a liberal provision for his faithful servant, Mr. Francis Barber, whom he looked upon as particularly under his protection, and whom he had all along treated truly as an humble friend. Footnote: Johnson, on his way to Scotland, changed horses, he wrote, at Darlington, where Mr. Cornelius Harrison, a cousin german of mine, was perpetual curate. He was the only one of my relations who ever rose in fortune above penury, or in character above neglect. Malone, in a note to later editions, shows that Johnson, shortly before his death, was trying to discover some of his poor relations. End of footnote. Having asked Dr. Brocklesby what would be a proper annuity to a favourite servant, and being answered that it must depend on the circumstances of the master, and that in the case of a nobleman £50 a year was considered as an adequate reward for many years' faithful service, "Then," said Johnson, "shall I be nobilissimus, for I mean to leave Frank £70 a year, and I desire you to tell him so." Footnote: Mr. Wyndham records that the day before Johnson made his will, he recommended Frank to him as to one who had will and power to protect him. He continues, "Having obtained my assent to this, he proposed that Frank should be called in, and desiring me to take him by the hand in token of the promise, repeated before him the recommendation he had just made of him, and the promise I had given to attend to it." End of footnote. It is strange, however, to think that Johnson was not free from that general weakness of being averse to execute a will, so that he delayed it from time to time. Footnote: Johnson wrote 5 years earlier to Mrs. Thrale about her husband's will, Do not let those fears prevail which you know to be unreasonable. A will brings the end of life no nearer. End of footnote. And had it not been for Sir John Hawkins's repeatedly urging it, I think it is probable that his kind resolution would not have been fulfilled. After making one which, as Sir John Hawkins informs us, extended no further than the promised annuity, Johnson's final disposition of his property was established by will and codicil, of which copies are subjoined. Footnote. In the name of God, Amen. I, Samuel Johnson, being in full possession of my faculties, but fearing this night may put an end to my life, do ordain this my last will and testament. I bequeath to God a soul polluted with many sins, but I hope purified by Jesus Christ. I leave £750 in the hands of Bennet Langton, Esquire, £300 in the hands of Mr. Barclay and Mr. Perkins, brewers, £150 in the hands of Dr. Percy, Bishop of Dromore, £1,000 3% annuities in the public funds, and £100 now lying by me in ready money. All these before-mentioned sums and property I leave, I say, to Sir Joshua Reynolds, Sir John Hawkins, and Dr. William Scott of Doctors' Commons, in trust for the following uses. That is to say, to pay to the representatives of the late William Innes, bookseller in St. Paul's Churchyard, the sum of £200. To Mrs. White, my female servant, £100 stock in the 3% annuities aforesaid. The rest of the aforesaid sums of money and property, together with my books, plate, and household furniture, I leave to the before-mentioned Sir Joshua Reynolds, Sir John Hawkins, and Dr. William Scott, also in trust to the use of Francis Barber, my manservant, a negro, in such a manner as they shall judge most fit and available to his benefit. And I appoint the aforesaid Sir Joshua Reynolds, Sir John Hawkins, and Dr. William Scott, sole executors of this my last will and testament, hereby revoking all former wills and testaments whatever. In witness whereof I hereunto subscribe my name and affix my seal, this 8th day of December 1784. Samuel Johnson, L.S. Signed, sealed, published, declared, and delivered by the said testator as his last will and testament, in the presence of us, the word to being first inserted in the opposite page, George Strachan, John Desmoulins. By way of codicil to my last will and testament, I, Samuel Johnson, give, devise, and bequeath my messuage or tenement situate at Lichfield in the county of Stafford, with the appurtenances in the tenure or occupation of Mrs. Bond of Lichfield aforesaid, or of Mr. Hinchman, her under-tenant, to my executors in trust to sell and dispose of the same, and the money arising from such a sale I give and bequeath as follows, namely, to Thomas and Benjamin, sons of Fisher Johnson, late of Leicester, and Whiting, daughter of Thomas Johnson, late of Coventry, and the granddaughter of the said Thomas Johnson, 1 full and equal 4th part each. But in case there shall be more granddaughters than one of the said Thomas Johnson, living at the time of my decease, I give and bequeath the part or share of that one to and equally between such granddaughters. I give and bequeath to the Reverend Mr. Rogers of Berkeley, near Frome, in the county of Somerset, the sum of £100, requesting him to apply the same towards the maintenance of Elizabeth Hearn, a lunatic. I also give and bequeath to my godchildren, the son and daughter of Mauritius Lowe, painter, each of them £100 of my stock in the 3% consolidated annuities, to be applied and disposed of by and at the discretion of my executors, in the education or settlement in the world of them, my said legatees. Also I give and bequeath to Sir John Hawkins, one of my executors, the Annales Ecclesiastici of Baronius, and Holinshed's and Stowe's Chronicles, and also an 8vo Common Prayer Book. To Bennet Langton, Esquire, I give and bequeath my Polyglot Bible. To Sir Joshua Reynolds, my great French Dictionary by Martinière, and my own copy of my folio English Dictionary of the last revision. To Sir William Scott, one of my executors, the Dictionnaire de Commerce, and Lectius's edition of the Greek poets. Mr. Wyndham, Poetae Graeci Heroici per Henricum Stephanum. To the Reverend Mr. Strahan, Vicar of Islington in Middlesex, Mill's Greek Testament, Baser's Greek Testament by Stephens, all my Latin Bibles, and my Greek Bible by Vecelius. To Dr. Heberden, Dr. Brocklesby, Dr. Butter, and Mr. Cruikshank, the surgeon who attended me, Mr. Holder, my apothecary, Gerard Hamilton, Esquire, Mrs. Gardiner of Snow Hill, Mrs. Frances Reynolds, Mr. Wheal, and the Reverend Mr. Wheal, his son, each a book at their election, to keep as a token of remembrance. I also give and bequeath to Mr. John Desmoulins £200 consolidated 3% annuities, and to Mr. Sastras, the Italian master, the sum of £5 to be laid out in books of piety for his own use. And whereas the said Bennet Langton hath agreed, in consideration of the sum of £750 mentioned in my will to be in his hands, to grant and secure an annuity of £70 payable during the life of me and my servant, Francis Barber, and the life of the survivor of us, to Mr. George Stubbs in trust for us, my mind and will is that, in case of my decease before the said agreement shall be perfected, the said sum of £750, and the bond for securing the said sum, shall go to the said Francis Barber. And I hereby give and bequeath to him the same, in lieu of the bequests in his favour contained in my said will. And I hereby empower my executors to deduct and retain all expenses that shall or may be incurred in the execution of my said will, or in this codicil thereto, out of such estate and effects as I shall die possessed of. All the rest, residue, and remainder of my estate and effects, I give and bequeath to my said executors, in trust for the said Francis Barber, his executors and administrators. Witness my hand and seal this 9th day of December 1784, Samuel Johnson, L.S. Signed, sealed, published, declared, and delivered by the said Samuel Johnson, as, and for a codicil to, his last will and testament, in the presence of us, who in his presence and at his request, and also in the presence of each other, have hereto subscribed our names as witnesses. John Copley, William Gibson, Henry Cole. Upon these testamentary deeds it is proper to make a few observations. His express declaration with his dying breath as a Christian, as it had been often practised in such solemn writings, was of real consequence from this great man, for the conviction of a mind equally acute and strong might well overbalance the doubts of others who were his contemporaries. The expression polluted may to some convey an impression of more than ordinary contamination, but that is not warranted by its genuine meaning, as appears from the Rambler. The same word is used in the will of Dr. Sanderson, Bishop of Lincoln, who was piety itself. His legacy of £200 to the representatives of Mr. Innes, bookseller in St. Paul's Churchyard, proceeded from a very worthy motive. He told Sir John Hawkins that his father having become a bankrupt, Mr. Innes had assisted him with money or credit to continue his business. This, said he, I consider as an obligation on me to be grateful to his descendants. The amount of his property proved to be considerably more than he had supposed it to be. Sir John Hawkins estimates the bequest to Francis Barber at a sum little short of £1,500, including an annuity of £70 to be paid to him by Mr. Langton, in consideration of £750 which Johnson had lent to that gentleman. Sir John seems not a little angry at this bequest, and mutters a caveat against ostentatious bounty and favour to negroes. But surely when a man has money entirely of his own acquisition, especially when he has no near relations, he may without blame dispose of it as he pleases, and with great propriety, to a faithful servant. Mr. Barber, by the recommendation of his master, retired to Lichfield, where he might pass the rest of his days in comfort. It has been objected that Johnson has omitted many of his best friends when leaving books to several, as tokens of his last remembrance. The names of Dr. Adams, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Burney, Mr. Hector, Mr. Murphy, and the author of this work, and others who were intimate with him, are not to be found in his will. This may be accounted for by considering that, as he was very near his dissolution at the time, he probably mentioned such as happened to occur to him, and that he may have recollected that he had formerly shown others such proofs of his regard that it was not necessary to crowd his will with their names. Mrs. Lucy Porter was much displeased that nothing was left to her, but, besides what I have now stated, she should have considered that she had left nothing to Johnson by her will, which was made during his lifetime, as appeared at her decease. His enumerating several persons in one group, and leaving them each a book at their election, might possibly have given occasion to a curious question as to the order of choice, had they not luckily fixed on different books. His library, though by no means handsome in its appearance, was sold by Mr. Christie for £247 9s, many people being desirous to have a book which had belonged to Johnson. In many of them he had written little notes, sometimes tender memorials of his departed wife, as, "This was dear Tetty's book," sometimes occasional remarks of different sorts. Mr. Lysons of Clifford's Inn has favoured me with the two following: in Holy Rules and Helps to Devotion, by Brian Dopper, Lord Bishop of Winton, Preces quidam, quidem, direto diligento tractasse, spero non inauditus, inauditas. In the Rosicrucian Infallible Axiomata, by John Hayden, gentleman, prefixed to which are some verses addressed to the author, signed Ambrose Waters, Master of Arts, Exeter College, Oxford. These Latin verses were written to Hobbes by Bathurst, upon his Treatise on Human Nature, and have no relation to the book. An odd fraud. Boswell. Note, see Appendix F for notes on this footnote. End of footnote. The consideration of numerous papers of which he was possessed seems to have struck Johnson's mind with a sudden anxiety, and as they were in great confusion, it is much to be lamented that he had not entrusted some faithful and discreet person with the care and selection of them, instead of which he in a precipitate manner burnt large masses of them, with little regard, as I apprehend, to discrimination. Not that I suppose we have thus been deprived of any compositions which he had ever intended for the public eye, but from what escaped the flames I judge that many curious circumstances, relating both to himself and other literary characters, have perished. Footnote. He burned, writes Mrs. Piozzi, many letters in the last week, I am told, and those written by his mother drew from him a flood of tears. Mr. Sastre saw him cast a melancholy look upon their ashes, which he took up and examined to see if a word was still legible. End of footnote. Two very valuable articles, I am sure, we have lost, which were 2 quarto volumes containing a full, fair, and most particular account of his own life from his earliest recollection. I owned to him that, having accidentally seen them, I had read a great deal in them, and, apologizing for the liberty I had taken, asked him if I could help it. Footnote. Boswell, in his Hebrides, says that Johnson, starting northwards on his tour, left in a drawer in Boswell's house one volume of a pretty full and curious diary of his life, of which I have, he continues, a few fragments. The other volume we may conjecture Johnson took with him, for Boswell had seen both, and apparently seen them only once. He mentions that these few fragments had been transferred to him by the residuary legatee, Francis Barber. One large fragment, which was published after Barber's death, he could never have seen, for he never quotes from it. End of footnote. He placidly answered, "My Sir, I do not think you could have helped it." I said that I had, for once in my life, felt half an inclination to commit theft. It had come into my mind to carry off those 2 volumes and never see him more. Upon my inquiring how this would have affected him, "Sir," said he, "I believe I should have gone mad." Footnote. One of these volumes, Sir John Hawkins informs us, he put into his pocket, for which the excuse he states is, that he meant to preserve it from falling into the hands of a person whom he describes, so as to make it sufficiently clear who is meant. "Having strong reasons," said he, "to suspect that this man might find and make an ill use of the book." Why Sir John should suppose that the gentleman alluded to would act in this manner, he has not thought fit to explain. But what he did was not approved of by Johnson, who, upon being acquainted of it without delay by a friend, expressed great indignation, and warmly insisted on the book being delivered up, and afterwards, in the supposition of his missing it without knowing by whom it had been taken, he said, "Sir, I should have gone out of the world, distrusting half mankind." Sir John next day wrote a letter to Johnson, assigning reasons for his conduct, upon which Johnson observed to Mr. Langton, "Bishop Sanderson could not have dictated a better letter. I could almost say, melius est sic penituisse quam non erasse." The agitation into which Johnson was thrown by this incident probably made him hastily burn those precious records which must ever be regretted. Boswell. According to Mr. Croker, Stephens was the man whom Hawkins said that he suspected. Pawson, in his witty panegyrical epistle on Hawkins against Johnson, says, "I shall attempt a translation in square brackets of melius est, etc., for the benefit of your mere English readers. There is more joy over a sinner that repenteth than over a just person that needeth no repentance. And we know from an authority not to be disputed that Johnson was a great lover of penitence. God put it in the mind to take it hence, that thou mightst win the more thy, in square brackets Johnson's, love, pleading so wisely in excuse of it." End of footnote. End of section 46. Section 47 of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4, by James Boswell, Section 47. During his last illness, Johnson experienced the steady and kind attachment of his numerous friends. Mr. Wheal has drawn up a narrative of what passed in the visits which he paid him during that time, from the 10th of November to the 13th of December, the day of his death inclusive, and has favoured me with the perusal of it, with permission to make extracts, which I have done. Nobody was more attentive to him than Mr. Langton, to whom he tenderly said, Te teneam moriens deficiente manu. Footnote: Tibullus addressed Cynthia in this manner: Te spectem suprema mihi convenerit hora, et teneam moriens deficiente manu. Before my closing eyes, dear Cynthia, stand, held weakly by my fainting, trembling hand. End of footnote. And I think it highly to the honour of Mr. Wyndham that his important occupations as an active statesman did not prevent him from paying assiduous respect to the dying sage whom he revered. Footnote: Wyndham was scarcely a statesman as yet, though for a few months of the year before he had been Chief Secretary for Ireland. He was in Parliament, but he had never spoken. His diary shows that he had no important occupations. On December the 12th, for instance, he records, came down about 10, read reviews, wrote to Mrs. Siddons, and then went to the ice. Came home only in time to dress and go to my mother's to dinner. End of footnote. Mr. Langton informs me that one day he found Mr. Burke and 4 or 5 more friends sitting with Johnson. Mr. Burke said to him, I am afraid, sir, such a number of us may be oppressive to you. No, sir, said Johnson, it is not so, and I must be in a wretched state indeed when your company would not be a delight to me. Mr. Burke, in a tremulous voice, expressive of being very tenderly affected, replied, My dear sir, you have always been too good to me. Immediately afterwards he went away. This was the last circumstance in the acquaintance of these two eminent men. Footnote: My father, writes Miss Burney, saw him once while I was away, and carried Mr. Burke with him, who was desirous of paying his respects to him once more in person. He rallied a little while they were there, and Mr. Burke, when they left him, said to my father, His work is almost done, and well has he done it. Burke in 1792 said in Parliament that Dr. Johnson's virtues were equal to his transcendent talents, and his friendship he valued as the greatest consolation and happiness of his life. End of footnote. The following particulars of his conversation within a few days of his death I give on the authority of Mr. John Nichols. Footnote: On the same undoubted authority I give a few articles which should have been inserted in chronological order, but which, now that they are before me, I should be sorry to omit. In 1736 Dr. Johnson had a particular inclination to have been engaged as an assistant to the Reverend Mr. Budworth, then headmaster of the grammar school at Brood in Staffordshire. An excellent person, who possessed every talent of a perfect instructor of youth, in a degree which, to use the words of one of the brightest ornaments of literature, the Reverend Dr. Hurd, Bishop of Worcester, has been rarely found in any of the profession since the days of Quintilian. Mr. Budworth, who was less known in his lifetime from that obscure situation to which the caprice of fortune oft condemns the most accomplished characters than his highest merit deserved, had been bred under Mr. Blackwell, in square brackets, Blackwall, at Market Bosworth, where Johnson was sometime an usher, which might naturally lead to the application. Mr. Budworth was certainly no stranger to the learning or abilities of Johnson, as he more than once lamented his having been under the necessity of declining the engagement, from an apprehension that the paralytic affection under which our great philologist laboured through life might become the object of imitation or of ridicule among his pupils. Captain Budworth, his grandson, has confirmed to me this anecdote. Among the early associates of Johnson at St. John's Gate was Samuel Boyce, well known by his ingenious productions, and not less noted for his imprudence. It was not unusual for Boyce to be a customer to the pawnbroker. On one of these occasions Dr. Johnson collected a sum of money to redeem his friend's clothes, which in 2 days after were pawned again. The sum, said Johnson, was collected by sixpences, at a time when to me sixpence was a serious consideration. Speaking one day of a person for whom he had a real friendship, but in whom vanity was somewhat too predominant, he observed that Kelly was so fond of displaying on his sideboard the plate which he possessed, that he added to it his spurs. For my part, said he, I never was master of a pair of spurs but once, and they are now at the bottom of the ocean. By the carelessness of Boswell's servant, they were dropped from the end of the boat on our return from the Isle of Skye. The late Reverend Mr. Samuel Badcock, having been introduced to Dr. Johnson by Mr. Nichols some years before his death, thus expressed himself in a letter to that gentleman: "How much I am obliged to you for the favour you did me in introducing me to Dr. Johnson. Tantum vidi vigilium. But to have seen him, and to have received a testimony of respect from him, was enough. I recollect all the conversation, and shall never forget one of his expressions. Speaking of Dr. P. in square brackets Priestley, whose writings I saw he estimated at a low rate, he said, 'You have proved him as deficient in probity as he is in learning.' I called him an index scholar, but he was not willing to allow him a claim even to that merit. He said that he borrowed from those who had been borrowers themselves, and did not know that the mistakes he adopted had been answered by others. I often think of our short but precious visit to this great man. I shall consider it as a kind of an era in my life." Boswell. Note, see Appendix G for notes on this footnote. End of footnote. He said that the parliamentary debates were the only part of his writings which then gave him any compunction, but that at the time he wrote them he had no conception he was imposing upon the world, though they were frequently written from very slender materials, and often from none at all, the mere coinage of his own imagination. He never wrote any part of his works with equal velocity. 3 columns of the magazine in an hour was no uncommon effort, which was faster than most persons could have transcribed that quantity. Of his friend Cave he always spoke with great affection. "Yet," said he, "Cave, who never looked out of his window but with a view to the Gentleman's Magazine, was a penurious paymaster. He would contract for lines by the 100, and expect the long 100. But he was a good man, and always delighted to have his friends at his table." When talking of a regular edition of his own works, he said that he had power, in square brackets from the booksellers, to print such an edition if his health admitted it, but he had no power to assign over any edition unless he could add notes, and so alter them as to make them new works, which his state of health forbade him to think of. "I may possibly live," said he, "or rather breathe, 3 days, or perhaps 3 weeks, but find myself daily and gradually weaker." He said at another time, 3 or 4 days only before his death, speaking of the little fear he had of undergoing a chirurgical operation, I would give one of these legs for a year more of life. I mean of comfortable life, not such as that which I now suffer. And lamented much his inability to read during his hours of restlessness. I used formerly, he added, when sleepless in bed, to read like a Turk. Footnote: he wrote to Dr. Taylor on February the 17th, 1776, "Keep yourself cheerful. Lie in bed with a lamp, and when you cannot sleep and are beginning to think, light your candle and read. At least light your candle. A man is perhaps never so much harassed by his own mind in the light as in the dark." End of footnote. Whilst confined by his last illness, it was his regular practice to have the church service read to him by some attentive and friendly divine. The Reverend Mr. Wheal performed this kind office in my presence for the last time, when by his own desire no more than the litany was read, in which his responses were in the deep and sonorous voice which Mr. Boswell has occasionally noticed, and with the most profound devotion that can be imagined. His hearing not being quite perfect, he more than once interrupted Mr. Wheal with, "Louder, my dear sir, louder, I entreat you, or you pray in vain." Footnote: Mr. Croker records the following communication from Mr. Wheal himself: "I must mention an incident which shows how ready Johnson was to make amends for any little incivility. When I called upon him the morning after he had pressed me rather roughly to read louder, he said, 'I was peevish yesterday, you must forgive me. When you are as old and as sick as I am, perhaps you may be peevish too.' Croker: 'I have heard him make many apologies of this kind.'" End of footnote. And when the service was ended, he with great earnestness turned round to an excellent lady who was present, saying, "I thank you, madam, very heartily for your kindness in joining me in this solemn exercise. Live well, I conjure you, and you will not feel the compunction at the last which I now feel." Footnote: to his friend Dr. Burney he said a few hours before he died, taking the doctor's hands within his, and casting his eyes towards heaven with a look of the most fervent piety, "My dear friend, while you live, do all the good you can." End of footnote. So truly humble were the thoughts which this great and good man entertained of his own approaches to religious perfection. Footnote: Mr. Wheal senior records of this day, "Dr. Johnson exhorted me to lead a better life than he had done." "A better life than you, my dear sir," I repeated. He replied warmly, "Don't compliment now." End of footnote. He was earnestly invited to publish a volume of devotional exercises, but this, though he listened to the proposal with much complacency, and a large sum of money was offered for it, he declined from motives of the sincerest modesty. He seriously entertained the thought of translating Taunus. Footnote: the French historian Jacques Auguste de Thou, 1553 to 1617, author of Historia sui temporis in 138 books. End of footnote. He often talked to me on the subject, and once in particular, when I was rather wishing that he would favour the world and gratify his sovereign by a life of Spenser, which he said that he would readily have done had he been able to obtain any new materials for the purpose, he added, "I have been thinking again, sir, of Taunus. It would not be the laborious task which you have supposed it. I should have no trouble but that of dictation, which will be performed as speedily as an amanuensis could write. It is to the mutual credit of Johnson and divines of different communions that although he was a steady Church of England man, there was nevertheless much agreeable intercourse between him and them. Let me particularly name the late Mr. La Trobe and Mr. Hutton of the Moravian profession. Footnote: Mr. Hutton was occasionally admitted to the royal breakfast table. "Hutton," said the king to him one morning, "is it true that you Moravians marry without any previous knowledge of each other?" "Yes, may it please your Majesty," returned Hutton, "our marriages are quite royal." One of his female missionaries for North America said to Dr. Johnson, "Whether my Saviour's service may be best carried on here or on the coast of Labrador, 'tis Mr. Hutton's business to settle. I will do my part either in a brick house or a snow house with equal alacrity." End of footnote. His intimacy with the English Benedictines at Paris has been mentioned, and as an additional proof of the charity in which he lived with good men of the Romish Church, I am happy in this opportunity of recording his friendship with the Reverend Thomas Hussey, Doctor of Divinity. Footnote: Burke said of Hussey, who was his friend and correspondent, that in his character he had made that very rare union of the enlightened statesman with the ecclesiastic. End of footnote. His Catholic Majesty's chaplain of embassy at the Court of London, that very respectable man, eminent not only for his powerful eloquence as a preacher, but for his various abilities and acquisitions. Nay, though Johnson loved a Presbyterian the least of all, this did not prevent his having a long and uninterrupted social connection with the Reverend Dr. James Fordyce, who, since his death, hath gratefully celebrated him in a warm strain of devotional composition. Amidst the melancholy clouds which hung over the dying Johnson, his characteristical manner showed itself on different occasions. When Dr. Warren, in the usual style, hoped that he was better, his answer was, "No, sir, you cannot conceive with what acceleration I advance towards death." A man whom he had never seen before was employed one night to sit up with him. Footnote: Being become very weak and helpless, it was thought necessary that a man should watch with him all night, and one was found in the neighbourhood for £0.50 a night. End of footnote. Being asked next morning how he liked his attendant, his answer was, "Not at all, sir. The fellow's an idiot. He is as awkward as a turnspit when first put into the wheel, and as sleepy as a dormouse." Mr. Wyndham having placed a pillow conveniently to support him, he thanked him for his kindness, and said, "That will do all that a pillow can do." He repeated with great spirit a poem consisting of several stanzas in 4 lines in alternate rhyme, which he said he had composed some years before on occasion of a rich extravagant young gentleman's coming of age, saying he had never repeated it but once since he composed it, and had given but one copy of it. That copy was given to Mrs. Thrale, now Piozzi, who has published it in a book which she entitles British Synonymy, but which is truly a collection of entertaining remarks and stories, no matter whether accurate or not. Footnote: Mrs. Piozzi, to add to the wonder, says that these verses were improviso, forgetting that Johnson wrote to her on August 8, 1780, "You have heard in the papers how blank is come to age. I have enclosed a short song of congratulation, which you must not show to anybody." It is odd that it should come into anybody's head. I hope you will read it with candour. It is, I believe, one of the author's first essays in that way of writing, and a beginner is always to be treated with tenderness. That it was Sir John Lade who had come of age, is shown by the entry of his birth, August 3rd, 1759, in the Gentleman's Magazine, 1759. He was the nephew and ward of Mr. Thrale, who seemed to think that Miss Burney would make him a good wife. According to Mr. Heywood, it was Lade who, having asked Johnson whether he advised him to marry, received as answer, "I would advise no man to marry, sir, who is not likely to propagate understanding." Mr. Heywood adds that he married a woman of the town, became a celebrated member of the Four in Hand Club, and contrived to waste the whole of a fine fortune before he died. In Campbell's Chancellors, a story is told of Sir John Ladd, who is, I suppose, the same man. The Prince of Wales, in 1805, asked Lord Thurlow to dinner, and also Ladd. When the old lion arrived, the Prince went into the anteroom to meet him, and apologized for the party being larger than he had intended, but added that Sir John was an old friend of his, and he could not avoid asking him to dinner. To which Thurlow, in his growling voice, answered, "I have no objection, sir, to Sir John Ladd in his proper place, which I take to be your Royal Highness's coach box, and not your table." End of footnote. Being a piece of exquisite satire, conveyed in a strain of pointed vivacity and humour, and in a manner of which no other instance is to be found in Johnson's writings, I shall here insert it. Footnote: British Synonymy was published in 1794, later, therefore, than Boswell's first and second editions. In both these, the latter half of this paragraph ran as follows: "From the specimen which Mrs. Piozzi has exhibited of it, it is much to be wished that the world could see the whole. Indeed, I can speak from my own knowledge, for having had the pleasure to read it, I found it to be a piece of exquisite satire, conveyed in a strain of pointed vivacity and humour, and in a manner of which no other instance is to be found in Johnson's writings." After describing the ridiculous and ruinous career of a wild spendthrift, he consoles him with this reflection: "You may hang or drown at last." End of footnote. Long expected 21 lingering year at length is flown. Pride and pleasure, pomp and plenty, great blank blank, Sir John, are now your own. Loosened from the miner's tether, free to mortgage or to sell, wild as wind and light as feather, bid the sons of thrift farewell. Call the Betsies, Kates, and Jennies, all the names that banish care. Lavish of your grandsire guineas, show the spirit of an heir. All that prey on vice or folly, joy to see their quarry fly. There the gamester, light and jolly, there the lender, grave and sly. Wealth, my lad, was made to wander, let it wander as it will. Call the jockey, call the pander, bid them come and take their fill. When the bonny blade carouses, pockets full and spirits high, what are acres, what are houses, only dirt, or wet or dry? Should the guardian, friend, or mother tell the woes of wilful waste, scorn their counsel, scorn their pother. You can hang or drown at last. As he opened a note which his servant brought to him, he said, "An odd thought strikes me. We shall receive no letters in the grave." Footnote: "Les morts n'écrivent point," says Madame de Maintenon. The note that Johnson received was, says Mr. Wheal, from Mr. Davies the bookseller, and mentioned a present of some pork. Upon which the doctor said, in a manner that seemed as if he thought it ill-timed, "Too much of this," or some such expression. End of footnote. End of section 47. Section 48 of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording, or LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4, by James Boswell, Section 48. He requested 3 things of Sir Joshua Reynolds: to forgive him £30 which he had borrowed of him, to read the Bible, and never to use his pencil on a Sunday. Footnote. Sir Walter Scott says that Reynolds observed the charge given him by Johnson on his deathbed, not to use his pencil of a Sunday for a considerable time, but afterwards broke it, being persuaded by some person who was impatient for a sitting that the doctor had no title to exact such a promise. Reynolds used to say that the pupil in art who looks for the Sunday with pleasure as an idle day will never make a painter. Dr. Johnson, said Lord Eldon, sent me a message on his deathbed to request that I would attend public worship every Sunday. The advice was not followed, for when a lawyer, a warm partisan of the Chancellor, called him one of the pillars of the Church, "No," said another lawyer, "he may be one of its buttresses, but certainly not one of its pillars, for he is never found within it." Lord Campbell says, "Lord Eldon was never present at public worship in London from one year's end to the other." Pleading in mitigation before Lord Ellenborough that he attended public worship in the country, he received the rebuke, "as if there were no God in town." End of footnote. Sir Joshua readily acquiesced. Footnote. Reynolds records, "During his last illness, when all hope was at an end, he appeared to be quieter and more resigned. His approaching dissolution was always present to his mind. A few days before he died, Mr. Langton and myself only present, he said he had been a great sinner, but he hoped he had given no bad example to his friends, that he had some consolation in reflecting that he had never denied Christ, and repeated the text, 'Whoever denies me,' etc. We were both very ready to assure him that we were conscious that we were better and wiser from his life and conversation, and that so far from denying Christ, he had been in this age his greatest champion." End of footnote. Indeed, he showed the greatest anxiety for the religious improvement of his friends, to whom he discoursed of its infinite consequence. He begged of Mr. Wheal to think of what he had said, and to commit it to writing, and upon being afterwards assured that this was done, pressed his hands, and in an earnest tone thanked him. Dr. Brocklesby, having attended him with the utmost assiduity and kindness as his physician and friend, he was peculiarly desirous that this gentleman should not entertain any loose speculative notions, but be confirmed in the truths of Christianity, and insisted on his writing down in his presence, as nearly as he could collect it, the import of what passed on the subject. And Dr. Brocklesby having complied with the request, he made him sign the paper, and urged him to keep it in his own custody as long as he lived. Footnote. Hannah More says that Johnson, having put up a fervent prayer that Brocklesby might become a sincere Christian, caught hold of his hand with great earnestness, and cried, "Doctor, you do not say Amen." The doctor looked foolishly, but after a pause cried, "Amen." Her account, however, is often not accurate. End of footnote. Johnson, with that native fortitude which, amidst all his bodily distress and mental sufferings, never forsook him, asked Dr. Brocklesby, as a man in whom he had confidence, to tell him plainly whether he could recover. "Give me," said he, "a direct answer." The doctor, having first asked him if he could bear the whole truth, which way soever it might lead, and being answered that he could, declared that in his opinion he could not recover without a miracle. "Then," said Johnson, "I will take no more physic, not even my opiates, for I have prayed that I may render up my soul to God unclouded." In this resolution he persevered, and at the same time used only the weakest kinds of sustenance. Being pressed by Mr. Windham to take somewhat more generous nourishment, lest too low a diet should have the very effect which he dreaded by debilitating his mind, he said, "I will take anything but inebriating sustenance." Footnote: Windham records that on the night of the 12th he urged him to take some sustenance, and desisted only upon his exclaiming, "It is all very childish. Let us hear no more of it." On his pressing him a second time, he answered that he refused no sustenance but inebriating sustenance. Windham thereupon asked him to take some milk, but he recurred to his general refusal, and begged that there might be an end of it. I then said that I hoped he would forgive my earnestness, when he replied eagerly, that from me nothing would be necessary by way of apology, adding with great fervour, in words which I shall, I hope, never forget, "God bless you, my dear Windham, through Jesus Christ," and concluding with a wish that we might meet in some humble portion of that happiness which God might finally vouchsafe to repentant sinners. These were the last words I ever heard him speak. I hurried out of the room with tears in my eyes, and more affected than I had been on any former occasion. It was at a later hour in this same night that Johnson scarified himself in 3 places. On Mr. Desmoulins making a difficulty of giving him the lancet, he said, "Don't you, if you have any scruples, but I will compel Frank." And on Mr. Desmoulins attempting to prevent Frank from giving it to him, and at last to restrain his hands, he grew very outrageous, so much so as to call Frank scoundrel, and to threaten Mr. Desmoulins that he would stab him. End of footnote. The Reverend Mr. Strahan, who was the son of his friend, and had been always one of his great favourites, had, during his last illness, the satisfaction of contributing to soothe and comfort him. That gentleman's house at Islington, of which he is vicar, afforded Johnson occasionally and easily an agreeable change of place and fresh air, and he attended also upon him in town in the discharge of the sacred offices of his profession. Mr. Strahan has given me the agreeable assurance that, after being in much agitation, Johnson became quite composed, and continued so until his death. Footnote: Mr. Strahan, mentioning the anxious fear which seized Johnson, says that his friends, who knew his integrity, observed it with equal astonishment and concern. He adds that his foreboding dread of the divine justice by degrees subsided into a pious trust and humble hope in the divine mercy. End of footnote. Dr. Brocklesby, who will not be suspected of fanaticism, obliged me with the following accounts. For some time before his death, all his fears were calmed and absorbed by the prevalence of his faith and his trust in the merits and propitiation of Jesus Christ. He talked often to me about the necessity of faith in the sacrifice of Jesus, as necessary beyond all good works whatever for the salvation of mankind. He pressed me to study Dr. Clarke and to read his sermons. I asked him why he pressed Dr. Clarke, an Arian. Because, said he is the fullest on the propitiatory sacrifice. Footnote: the change of his sentiments with regard to Dr. Clarke is thus mentioned to me in a letter from the late Dr. Adams, Master of Pembroke College, Oxford. The doctor's prejudices were the strongest, and certainly in another sense the weakest, that ever possessed a sensible man. You know his extreme zeal for orthodoxy, but did you ever hear what he told me himself? That he had made it a rule not to admit Dr. Clarke's name in his dictionary. This, however, wore off. At some distance of time, he advised with me what books he should read in defence of the Christian religion. I recommended Clarke's Evidences of Natural and Revealed Religion as the best of the kind, and I find in what is called his Prayers and Meditations that he was frequently employed in the latter part of his time in reading Clarke's sermons. Boswell. End of footnote. Johnson, having thus in his mind the true Christian scheme, at once rational and consolatory, uniting justice and mercy in the divinity with the improvement of human nature, previous to his receiving the Holy Sacrament in his apartment, composed and fervently uttered this prayer: Almighty and most merciful Father, I am now, as to human eyes it seems, about to commemorate for the last time the death of thy Son, Jesus Christ, our Saviour and Redeemer. Grant, O Lord, that my whole hope and confidence may be in his merits and thy mercy. Enforce and accept my imperfect repentance. Make this commemoration available to the confirmation of my faith, the establishment of my hope, and the enlargement of my charity, and make the death of thy Son Jesus Christ effectual to my redemption. Have mercy upon me, and pardon the multitude of my offences. Bless my friends. Have mercy upon all men. Support me by thy Holy Spirit in the days of weakness and at the hour of death, and receive me at my death to everlasting happiness, for the sake of Jesus Christ. Amen. Having, as has already been mentioned, made his will on the 8th and 9th of December, and settled all his worldly affairs, he languished till Monday the 13th of that month, when he expired about 7 o'clock in the evening, with so little apparent pain that his attendants hardly perceived when his dissolution took place. Of his last moments, my brother Thomas David has furnished me with the following particulars. The doctor, from the time that he was certain his death was near, appeared to be perfectly resigned. Footnote: the counterpart of Johnson's end, and of one striking part of his character, may be found in Mr. Fearing in The Pilgrim's Progress. Mr. Fearing was, said Honesty, a very zealous man. Difficulty, lions, or Vanity Fair, he feared not at all. It was only sin, death, and hell that were to him a terror, because he had some doubts about his interest in that celestial country. I dare believe, Greatheart replied, that as the proverb is, he could have bit a firebrand had it stood in his way, but the things with which he was oppressed no man ever yet could shake off with ease. End of footnote. Was seldom or never fretful or out of temper, and often said to his faithful servant, who gave me this account, "Attend, Francis, to the salvation of your soul, which is the object of greatest importance." He also explained to him passages in the Scripture, and seemed to have pleasure in talking upon religious subjects. On Monday, the 13th of December, the day on which he died, a Miss Morris, daughter to a particular friend of his, called, and said to Francis that she begged to be permitted to see the doctor, that she might earnestly request him to give her his blessing. Francis went into his room, followed by the young lady, and delivered the message. The doctor turned himself in his bed and said, "God bless you, my dear." These were the last words he spoke. His difficulty of breathing increased till about 7 o'clock in the evening, when Mr. Barber and Mrs. Desmoulins, who were sitting in the room, observing that the noise he made in breathing had ceased, went to the bed, and found he was dead. Footnote: the following letter, written with an agitated hand from the very chamber of death by Mr. Langton, and obviously interrupted by his feelings, will not unaptly close the story of so long a friendship. The letter is not addressed, but Mr. Langton's family believe it was intended for Mr. Boswell. My dear Sir, after many conflicting hopes and fears respecting the event of this heavy return of illness which has assailed our honoured friend Dr. Johnson since his arrival from Lichfield, about 4 days ago the appearances grew more and more awful, and this afternoon at 8 o'clock, when I arrived at his house to see how he should be going on, I was acquainted at the door that about 3/4 of an hour before he breathed his last. I am now writing in the room where his venerable remains exhibit a spectacle, the interesting solemnity of which, difficult as it would be in any sort to find terms to express, so to you, my dear Sir, whose own sensations will paint it so strongly, it would be of all men the most superfluous to attempt to. Croker. The interruption of the note was perhaps due to a discovery made by Langton. Hawkins says, "At 11, the evening of Johnson's death, Mr. Langton came to me, and in an agony of mind gave me to understand that our friend had wounded himself in several parts of the body. To the dying man, on the last day of his existence, on this side the grave, the desire of life, to use Murphy's words, had returned with all its former vehemence. In the hope of drawing off the dropsical water, he gave himself these wounds. He lost a good deal of blood, and no doubt hastened his end. Langton must have suspected that Johnson intentionally shortened his life." End of footnote. About 2 days after his death, the following very agreeable account was communicated to Mr. Malone in a letter by the Honourable John Byng, to whom I am much obliged for granting me permission to introduce it in my work. Dear Sir, since I saw you, I have had a long conversation with Causton, footnote, servant to the Right Honourable William Wyndham Boswell, end of footnote, who sat up with Dr. Johnson from 9 o'clock on Sunday evening till 10 o'clock on Monday morning. And from what I can gather from him, it should seem that Dr. Johnson was perfectly composed, steady in hope, and resigned to death. At the interval of each hour they assisted him to sit up in his bed and move his legs, which were in much pain, when he regularly addressed himself to fervent prayer. And though sometimes his voice failed him, his senses never did during that time. The only sustenance he received was cider and water. He said his mind was prepared, and the time to his dissolution seemed long. At 6 in the morning he inquired the hour, and on being informed, said that all went on regularly, and he felt he had but a few hours to live. At 10 o'clock in the morning he parted from Causton, saying, "You should not detain Mr. Wyndham's servant. I thank you. Bear my remembrance to your master." Causton says that no man could appear more collected, more devout, or less terrified at the thoughts of the approaching minute. This account, which is so much more agreeable than, and somewhat different from, yours, has given us the satisfaction of thinking that the great man died as he lived, full of resignation, strengthened in faith, and joyful in hope. A few days before his death he had asked Sir John Hawkins, as one of his executors, where he should be buried, and on being answered, doubtless in Westminster Abbey, seemed to feel a satisfaction very natural to a poet, and indeed, in my opinion, very natural to every man of any imagination who has no family sepulchre in which he can be laid with his fathers. Accordingly, on Monday, December the 20th, his remains were deposited in that noble and renowned edifice, and over his grave was placed a large blue flagstone with this inscription: Samuel Johnson, legum doctor, obiit 13 die Decembris, anno Domini 1284, aetatis suae 75. His funeral was attended by a respectable number of his friends, particularly such of the members of the literary club as were then in town, and was also honoured with the presence of several of the Reverend Chapter of Westminster. Mr. Burke, Sir Joseph Banks, Mr. Wyndham, Mr. Langton, Sir Charles Bunbury, and Mr. Coleman bore his pall. Footnote: Sir Joshua Reynolds and Paoli were among the mourners. Among the Nichols papers in the British Museum is preserved an invitation card to the funeral. End of footnote. His schoolfellow, Dr. Taylor, performed the mournful office of reading the burial service. Footnote: Dr. Burney wrote to the Reverend T. Twining on Christmas Day, 1784, "The Dean and Chapter of Westminster Abbey lay all the blame on Sir John Hawkins for suffering Johnson to be so unworthily interred." The knight's first inquiry at the Abbey, in giving orders, as the most acting executor, was, what would be the difference in the expense between a public and private funeral, and was told only a few pounds to the prebendaries, and about 90 pairs of gloves to the choir and attendants. And he then determined that, as Dr. Johnson had no music in him, he should choose the cheapest manner of interment. And for this reason there was no organ heard, or burial service sung, for which he suffers the Dean and Chapter to be abused in all the newspapers, and joins in their abuse when the subject is mentioned in conversation. Burney mentions a report that Hawkins had been slandering Johnson. Charles Burney, Jr., had written the day after the funeral, "The executor, Sir John Hawkins, did not manage things well, for there was no anthem or choir service performed, no lesson, but merely what is read over every old woman that is buried by the parish. Dr. Taylor read the service, but so." End of footnote. I trust I shall not be accused of affectation when I declare that I find myself unable to express all that I felt upon the loss of such a guide, philosopher, and friend. Footnote: On the subject of Johnson, I may adopt the words of Sir John Harrington concerning his venerable tutor and diocesan, Dr. John Still, Bishop of Bath and Wells, who hath given me some helps, more hopes, all encouragements in my best studies, to whom I never came but I grew more religious, from whom I never went but I parted better instructed. Of him, therefore, my acquaintance, my friend, my instructor, if I speak much, it were not to be marvelled. If I speak frankly, it is not to be blamed. And though I speak partially, it were to be pardoned. There is one circumstance in Sir John's character of Bishop Still which is peculiarly applicable to Johnson. He became so famous a disputer that the learnedest were even afraid to dispute with him, and he, finding his own strength, could not stick to warn them in their arguments to take heed to their answers, like a perfect fencer that will tell aforehand in which button he will give the venue, or like a cunning chess player that will appoint aforehand with which pawn and in what place he will give the mate. Boswell. End of footnote. I shall therefore not say one word of my own, but adopt those of an eminent friend, which he uttered with an abrupt felicity, superior to all studied compositions. He has made a chasm, which not only nothing can fill up, but which nothing has a tendency to fill up. Johnson is dead, let us go to the next best. There is nobody, no man can be said to put you in mind of Johnson. Footnote. His death, writes Hannah More, makes a kind of era in literature. One who had long known him said of him, "In general, you may tell what the man to whom you are speaking will say next. This you can never do of Johnson." End of footnote. End of section 48. Section 49 of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4, by James Boswell, Section 49. As Johnson had abundant homage paid to him during his life, so no writer in this nation ever had such an accumulation of literary honours after his death. Footnote. Beside the dedications to him by Dr. Goldsmith, the Reverend Dr. Franklin, and the Reverend Mr. Wilson, which I have mentioned according to their dates, there was one by a lady of a versification of Anningate and Adjut, and one by the ingenious Mr. Walker of his rhetorical grammar. I have introduced into this work several compliments paid to him in the writings of his contemporaries, but the number of them is so great that we may fairly say that there was almost a general tribute. Let me not be forgetful of the honour done to him by Colonel Middleton of Gwenynog near Denby, who, on the banks of a rivulet in his park, where Johnson delighted to stand and repeat verses, erected an urn with the following inscription: "This spot was often dignified by the presence of Samuel Johnson, Doctor of Laws, whose moral writings, exactly conformable to the precepts of Christianity, gave ardour to virtue and confidence to truth." As no inconsiderable circumstance of his fame, we must reckon the extraordinary zeal of the artists to extend and perpetuate his image. I can enumerate: a bust by Mr. Nollekens, and the many casts which are made from it; several pictures by Sir Joshua Reynolds, from one of which, in the possession of the Duke of Dorset, Mr. Humphrey executed a beautiful miniature in enamel; one by Mrs. Frances Reynolds, Sir Joshua's sister; one by Mr. Zoffany, and one by Mr. Opie; and the following engravings of his portrait: 1. One by Cook, from Sir Joshua, for the proprietor's edition of his folio dictionary. 2. One from Ditto by Ditto for their quarto edition. 3. One from Opie by Heath for Harrison's edition of his dictionary. 4. One from Nolliken's bust of him by Bartolozzi for Fielding's quarto edition of his dictionary. 5. One small from Harding by Trotter for his Beauties. 6. One small from Sir Joshua by Trotter for his Lives of the Poets. 7. One small from Sir Joshua by Hall for The Rambler. 8. One small from an original drawing in the possession of Mr. John Simcoe, etched by Trotter for another edition of his Lives of the Poets. 9. One small, no painter's name, etched by Taylor for his Johnsoniana. 10. One folio whole length with his oak stick, as described in Boswell's Tour, drawn and etched by Trotter. 11. One large mezzotinto from Sir Joshua by Doughty. 12. One large Roman head from Sir Joshua by Marquis. 13. One octavo holding a book to his eye from Sir Joshua by Hall for his Works. 14. One small from a drawing from the Life and engraved by Trotter for his Life published by Kearsley. 15. One large from Opie by Mr. Townley, brother of Mr. Townley of the Commons, an ingenious artist who resided some time at Berlin, and has the honour of being engraver to His Majesty the King of Prussia. This is one of the finest mezzotintos that ever was executed, and what renders it of extraordinary value, the plate was destroyed after 4 or 5 impressions only were taken off. One of them is in the possession of Sir William Scott. Mr. Townley has lately been prevailed with to execute and publish another of the same, that it may be more generally circulated among the admirers of Dr. Johnson. 16. One large from Sir Joshua's first picture of him by Heath for this work in quarto. 17. One octavo by Baker for the octavo edition. 18. And one for Lavater's Essay on Physiognomy, in which Johnson's countenance is analysed upon the principles of that fanciful writer. There are also several seals with his head cut on them, particularly a very fine one by that eminent artist Edward Birch, Esquire, Royal Academy, in the possession of the younger Dr. Charles Burney. Let me add, as a proof of the popularity of his character, that there are copper pieces struck at Birmingham with his head impressed on them, which pass current as halfpence there and in the neighbouring parts of the country. Boswell. Note, see Appendix H for notes on this footnote. End of footnote. A sermon upon that event was preached in St. Mary's Church, Oxford, before the University, by the Reverend Mr. Agatha of Magdalen College. Footnote. It is not yet published. In a letter to me, Mr. Agatha says, "My sermon before the University was more engaged with Dr. Johnson's moral than his intellectual character. It particularly examined his fear of death, and suggested several reasons for the apprehension of the good and the indifference of the infidel in their last hours. This was illustrated by contrasting the death of Dr. Johnson and Mr. Hume. The text was Job, chapter 21, verses 22 to 26. Boswell. It was preached on July the 23rd, 1786, and not at Johnson's death. It is entitled, On the Difference between the Deaths of the Righteous and the Wicked, illustrated in the instance of Dr. Samuel Johnson and David Hume, Esquire. The text is from Job chapter 21, verses 23, not 22, 26. It was published in 1800. Neither Johnson nor Hume is mentioned in the sermon itself by name. Its chief, perhaps its sole merit, is its brevity. End of footnote. The lives, the memoirs, the essays, both in prose and verse, which have been published concerning him, would make many volumes. The numerous attacks, too, upon him I consider as part of his consequence, upon the principle which he himself so well knew and asserted. Many who trembled at his presence were forward in assault when they no longer apprehended danger. When one of his little pragmatical foes was invidiously snarling at his fame at Sir Joshua Reynolds's table, the Reverend Dr. Parr exclaimed with his usual bold animation, "Ay, now that the old lion is dead, every ass thinks he may kick at him." A monument for him in Westminster Abbey was resolved upon soon after his death, and was supported by a most respectable contribution. Footnote: May 26, 1791. After the doctor's death, Burke, Sir Joshua Reynolds, and Boswell sent an ambling circular letter to me, begging subscriptions for a monument for him. I would not deign to write an answer, but sent down word by my footman, as I would have done to parish officers, with a brief that I would not subscribe. Horace Walpole Letters. In Malone's correspondence are complaints of the backwardness of the members of the literary club to pay the amounts nominally subscribed by them. End of footnote. But the Dean and Chapter of St. Paul's, having come to a resolution of admitting monuments there, upon a liberal and magnificent plan, that cathedral was afterwards fixed on as the place in which a cenotaph should be erected to his memory, and in the cathedral of his native city of Lichfield a smaller one is to be erected. Footnote: It was, says Malone, owing to Reynolds that the monument was erected in St. Paul's. In his journey to Flanders he had lamented that sculpture languished in England, and was almost confined to monuments to eminent men. But even in these it had not fair play, for Westminster Abbey was so full that the recent monuments appeared ridiculous, being stuck up in odd holes and corners. On the other hand, St. Paul's looked forlorn and desolate. Here monuments should be erected under the direction of the Royal Academy. He took advantage of Johnson's death to make a beginning with the plan which he had here sketched, and induced his friends to give up their intention of setting up the monument in the Abbey. He asked Dr. Parr, but in vain, to include in the epitaph Johnson's title of Professor of Ancient Literature to the Royal Academy, as it was on this pretext that he persuaded the academicians to subscribe 100 guineas. The question was raised whose monument should be first erected in St. Paul's, and Johnson proposed Milton's. End of footnote. To compose his epitaph could not but excite the warmest competition of genius. Footnote. The Reverend Dr. Parr, on being requested to undertake it, thus expressed himself in a letter to William Seward, Esquire: I leave this mighty task to some hardier and some abler writer. The variety and splendour of Johnson's attainments, the peculiarities of his character, his private virtues, and his literary publications, fill me with confusion and dismay when I reflect upon the confined and difficult species of composition in which alone they can be expressed with propriety upon his monument. But I understand that this great scholar and warm admirer of Johnson has yielded to repeated solicitations, and executed the very difficult undertaking. Boswell. Dr. Johnson's monument, consisting of a colossal figure leaning against a column, has, since the death of our author, been placed in St. Paul's Cathedral. The epitaph was written by the Reverend Dr. Parr, and is as follows: Samuele Johnson, grammatico et critico, scriptorum Anglicorum literate perito, poetae luminibus sententiarum et ponderibus feborum admirabili, magistro virtutis gravissimo, homini optimo et singularis exempli, qui vixit annis Septuaginta quinque, mensibus duobus diebus tredecim, decesit idibus decembribus anno Christi millesimo septigentesimo octagesimo quarto, sepultus in aribus Sancti Petri West Monasteriensis die 13 ante calendas Januarias anno Christi millesimo septigentesimo octagesimo quinto. Amici et sodales rari pecunio condata hoc monumentum faciendum curaverunt. On a scroll in his hand are the following words in Greek: En maca recipon onan taxi ossai ham oib. On one side of the monument, faciebat Johannes Bacon, sculptor, in the year of Christ 1795. The subscription for this monument, which cost 1100 guineas, was begun by the Literary Club, Malone. End of footnote. If laudare a laudato viro be praise which is highly estimable, I should not forgive myself were I to omit the following sepulchral verses on the author of the English Dictionary, written by the Right Honourable Henry Flood. No need of Latin nor of Greek to grace our Johnson's memory or inscribe his grave. His native language claims this mournful space to pay the immortality he gave. Footnote. To prevent any misconception on this subject, Mr. Malone, by whom these lines were obligingly communicated, requests me to add the following remark: in justice to the late Mr. Flood, now himself wanting and highly meriting an epitaph from his country, to which his transcendent talents did the highest honour as well as the most important service, it should be observed that these lines were by no means intended as a regular monumental inscription for Dr. Johnson. Had he undertaken to write an appropriated and discriminative epitaph for that excellent and extraordinary man, those who knew Mr. Flood's vigour of mind will have no doubt that he would have produced one worthy of his illustrious subject. But the fact was merely this: in December 1789, after a large subscription had been made for Dr. Johnson's monument, to which Mr. Flood liberally contributed, Mr. Malone happened to call on him at his house in Berners Street, and the conversation turning on the proposed monument, Mr. Malone maintained that the epitaph, by whomsoever it should be written, ought to be in Latin. Mr. Flood thought differently. The next morning, in the postscript to a note on another subject, he mentioned that he continued of the same opinion as on the preceding day, and subjoined the lines above given. Boswell. Cooper also composed an epitaph for Johnson, though not one of much merit. End of footnote. The character of Samuel Johnson has, I trust, been so developed in the course of this work that they who have honoured it with a perusal may be considered as well acquainted with him. As, however, it may be expected that I should collect into one view the capital and distinguishing features of this extraordinary man, I shall endeavour to acquit myself of that part of my biographical undertaking, however difficult it may be to do that which many of my readers will do better for themselves. Footnote. As I do not see any reason to give a different character of my illustrious friend now from what I formerly gave, the greatest part of the sketch of him in my Journal of a Tour to the Hebrides is here adopted. Boswell. End of footnote. His figure was large and well formed, and his countenance of the cast of an ancient statue. Yet his appearance was rendered strange and somewhat uncouth by convulsive cramps, by the scars of that distemper which it was once imagined the royal touch could cure, and by a slovenly mode of dress. He had the use only of one eye, yet so much does mind govern and even supply the deficiency of organs, that his visual perceptions, as far as they extended, were uncommonly quick and accurate. So morbid was his temperament that he never knew the natural joy of a free and vigorous use of his limbs. When he walked, it was like the struggling gait of one in fetters. When he rode, he had no command or direction of his horse, but was carried as if in a balloon. That with his constitution and habits of life he should have lived 75 years is a proof that an inherent vivida vis is a powerful preservative of the human frame. Man is, in general, made up of contradictory qualities. These will ever show themselves in strange succession, where a consistency, in appearance at least, if not in reality, has not been attained by long habits of philosophical discipline. In proportion to the native vigour of the mind, the contradictory qualities will be the more prominent and more difficult to be adjusted. And therefore we are not to wonder that Johnson exhibited an eminent example of this remark which I have made upon human nature. At different times he seemed a different man in some respects, not, however, in any great or essential article, upon which he had fully employed his mind and settled certain principles of duty, but only in his manners and in the display of argument and fancy in his talk. He was prone to superstition, but not to credulity. Though his imagination might incline him to a belief of the marvellous and the mysterious, his vigorous reason examined the evidence with jealousy. He was a sincere and zealous Christian of High Church of England and monarchical principles, which he would not tamely suffer to be questioned, and had, perhaps at an early period, narrowed his mind somewhat too much, both as to religion and politics. His being impressed with the danger of extreme latitude in either, though he was a very independent spirit, occasioned his appearing somewhat unfavourable to the prevalence of that noble freedom of sentiment which is the best possession of man. Nor can it be denied that he had many prejudices, which, however, frequently suggested many of his pointed sayings, that rather show a playfulness of fancy than any settled malignity. He was steady and inflexible in maintaining the obligations of religion and morality, both from a regard for the order of society and from a veneration for the great source of all order, correct, nay stern in his taste, hard to please and easily offended. Footnote. He was always indulgent to the young. He never attacked the unassuming, nor meant to terrify the diffident Fanny Burney. End of footnote. Impetuous and irritable in his temper, but of a most humane and benevolent heart, which showed itself not only in a most liberal charity as far as his circumstances would allow, but in 1,000 instances of active benevolence. Footnote. In the Autobiography, a collection of essays published at Oxford, there is an admirable paper upon the character of Johnson, written by the Reverend Dr. Home, the last excellent Bishop of Norwich. The following passage is eminently happy. To reject wisdom because the person of him who communicates it is uncouth and his manners are inelegant, what is it but to throw away a pineapple, and a sign for a reason, the roughness of its coat. Boswell. End of footnote. He was afflicted with a bodily disease which made him often restless and fretful, and with a constitutional melancholy, the clouds of which darkened the brightness of his fancy and gave a gloomy cast to his whole course of thinking. We therefore ought not to wonder at his sallies of impatience and passion at any time, especially when provoked by obtrusive ignorance or presuming petulance. And allowance must be made for his uttering hasty and satirical sallies even against his best friends. And surely, when it is considered that amid sickness and sorrow, footnote, the English dictionary was written amidst inconvenience and distraction, in sickness and in sorrow, preface to Johnson's dictionary, end of footnote, he exerted his faculties in so many works for the benefit of mankind, and particularly that he achieved the great and admirable dictionary of our language, we must be astonished at his resolution. The solemn text of him to whom much is given, much will be required, seems to have been ever present to his mind in a rigorous sense, and to have made him dissatisfied with his labours and acts of goodness, however comparatively great, so that the unavoidable consciousness of his superiority was in that respect a cause of disquiet. He suffered so much from this, and from the gloom which perpetually haunted him and made solitude frightful, that it may be said of him, if in this life only he had hope, he was of all men most miserable. He loved praise when it was brought to him, but was too proud to seek for it. He was somewhat susceptible of flattery. As he was general and unconfined in his studies, he cannot be considered as master of any one particular science, but he had accumulated a vast and various collection of learning and knowledge, which was so arranged in his mind as to be ever in readiness to be brought forth. But his superiority over other learned men consisted chiefly in what may be called the art of thinking, the art of using his mind, a certain continual power of seizing the useful substance of all that he knew, and exhibiting it in a clear and forcible manner, so that knowledge, which we often see to be no better than lumber in men of dull understanding, was in him true, evident, and actual wisdom. His moral precepts are practical, for they are drawn from an intimate acquaintance with human nature. His maxims carry conviction, for they are founded on the basis of common sense and a very attentive and minute survey of real life. His mind was so full of imagery that he might have been perpetually a poet. Yet it is remarkable that, however rich his prose is in this respect, his poetical pieces in general have not much of that splendour, but are rather distinguished by strong sentiment and acute observation, conveyed in a harmonious and energetic verse, particularly in heroic couplets. Though usually grave and even awful in his deportment, he possessed uncommon and peculiar powers of wit and humour. He frequently indulged himself in colloquial pleasantry, and the heartiest merriment was often enjoyed in his company, with this great advantage, that as it was entirely free from any poisonous tincture of vice or impiety, it was salutary to those who shared in it. He had accustomed himself to such accuracy in his common conversation, footnote, though a perfect resemblance of Johnson is not to be found in any age, parts of his character are admirably expressed by Clarendon in drawing that of Lord Falkland, whom the noble and masterly historian describes at his seat near Oxford. Such an immenseness of wit, such a solidity of judgment, so infinite a fancy bound in by a most logical ratiocination. His acquaintance was cultivated by the most polite and accurate men, so that his house was an university in less volume, whither they came not so much for repose as study, and to examine and refine those grosser propositions which laziness and consent made current in conversation. Bell's account of ménage may also be quoted as exceedingly applicable to the great subject of this work. His illustrious friends erected a very glorious monument to him in the collection entitled Ménagiana. Those who judge of things aright will confess that this collection is very proper to show the extent of genius and learning which was the character of Ménage. And I may be bold to say that the excellent works he published will not distinguish him from other learned men so advantageously as this. To publish books of great learning, to make Greek and Latin verses exceedingly well turned, is not a common talent, I own, neither is it extremely rare. It is incomparably more difficult to find men who can furnish discourse about an infinite number of things, and who can diversify them in 100 ways. How many authors are there who are admired for their works, on account of the vast learning that is displayed in them, who are not able to sustain a conversation? Those who know Ménage only by his books might think he resembled those learned men. But if you show the Ménagiana, you distinguish him from them, and make him known by a talent which is given to very few learned men. There it appears that he was a man who spoke off-hand 1,000 good things. His memory extended to what was ancient and modern, to the court and to the city, to the dead and to the living languages, to things serious and things jocose, in a word, to 1,000 sorts of subjects. That which appeared a trifle to some readers of the Ménagiana, who did not consider circumstances, caused admiration in other readers who minded the difference between what a man speaks without preparation and that which he prepares for the press. And therefore we cannot sufficiently commend the care which his illustrious friends took to erect a monument so capable of giving him immortal glory. They were not obliged to rectify what they had heard him say, for in so doing they had not been faithful historians of his conversations. Boswell. Boswell's quotation from Clarendon differs somewhat from the original. End of footnote. He had accustomed himself to such accuracy in his common conversation, that he at all times expressed his thoughts with great force and an elegant choice of language, the effect of which was aided by his having a loud voice and a slow, deliberate utterance. In him were united a most logical head with a most fertile imagination, which gave him an extraordinary advantage in arguing, for he could reason close or wide, as he saw best for the moment. Exulting in his intellectual strength and dexterity, he could, when he pleased, be the greatest sophist that ever contended in the lists of declamation, and, from a spirit of contradiction and a delight in showing his powers, he would often maintain the wrong side with equal warmth and ingenuity, so that when there was an audience his real opinions could seldom be gathered from his talk, though when he was in company with a single friend he would discuss a subject with genuine fairness. But he was too conscientious to make error permanent and pernicious by deliberately writing it, and in all his numerous works he earnestly inculcated what appeared to him to be the truth, his piety being constant and the ruling principle of all his conduct. Footnote. To this finely drawn character we may add the noble testimony of Sir Joshua Reynolds. His pride had no meanness in it. There was nothing little or mean about him. End of footnote. Such was Samuel Johnson, a man whose talents, acquirements, and virtues were so extraordinary that the more his character is considered, the more he will be regarded by the present age and by posterity with admiration and reverence. Footnote. In Johnson's character of Boerhaave there is much that applies equally well to himself. Thus died Boerhaave, a man formed by nature for great designs, and guided by religion in the exertion of his abilities. He was of a robust and athletic constitution of body, so hardened by early severities and wholesome fatigue, that he was insensible of any sharpness of air or inclemency of weather. He was tall, and remarkable for extraordinary strength. There was in his air and motion something rough and artless, but so majestic and great at the same time, that no man ever looked upon him without veneration and a kind of tacit submission to the superiority of his genius. He was never soured by calumny and detraction, nor ever thought it necessary to confute them. For they are sparks, said he, which, if you do not blow them, will go out of themselves. He was not to be overawed or depressed by the presence, frowns, or insolence of great men, but persisted on all occasions in the right, with a resolution always present and always calm. Nor was he unacquainted with the art of recommending truth by elegance, and embellishing the philosopher with polite literature. He knew the importance of his own writings to mankind, and lest he might by roughness and barbarity of style, too frequent among men of great learning, disappoint his own intentions and make his labours less useful, he did not neglect the politer arts of eloquence and poetry. Thus was his learning at once various and exact, profound and agreeable. He asserted on all occasions the divine authority and sacred efficacy of the Holy Scriptures, and maintained that they alone taught the way of salvation, and that they only could give peace of mind. End of footnote. End of section 49.
Appendix A of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary J. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4, by James Boswell. Appendix A. There are at least 3 accounts of this altercation in 3 versions of the lines. 2 of these versions nearly agree. The earliest is found in a letter by Richard Burke, Sr., dated January 6, 1773, the second in the Annual Register for 1776, and the third in Miss Reynolds' Recollections. R. Burke places the scene in Reynolds' house. Whether he himself was present is not clear. The Dean, he says, asserted that after 45 a man did not improve. "I differ with you, sir," answered Johnson. "A man may improve, and you yourself have great room for improvement." The Dean was confounded, and for the instant silent. Recovering, he said, "On recollection, I see no cause to alter my opinion, except that I was to call it improvement for a man to grow, which I allow he may, positive, rude, and insolent, and save arguments by brutality." Neither the Annual Register nor Miss Reynolds reports the Dean's speech, but she says that soon after the ladies withdrew, Dr. Johnson followed them, and sitting down by the lady of the house, that is, by herself, if they were at Sir Joshua's, he said, "I am very sorry for having spoken so rudely to the Dean." "You may very well, sir." "Yes," he said, "it was highly improper to speak in that style to a minister of the gospel, and I am the more hurt on reflecting with what mild dignity he received it." If Johnson really spoke of the dean's mild dignity, it is clear that Richard Burke's account is wrong. But it was written just after the scene, and Boswell says there was a pretty smart altercation. Miss Reynolds continues, "When the dean came up into the drawing-room, Dr. Johnson immediately rose from his seat and made him sit on the sofa by him, and with such a beseeching look for pardon, and with such fond gestures, literally smoothing down his arms and knees, etc." The Annual Register says that Barnard the next day sent the verses addressed to Sir Joshua Reynolds and Company. On the next page I give Richard Burke's version of the lines, and show the various readings. Richard Burke's version. I lately thought no man alive could e'er improve past 45, and ventured to assert it. The observation was not new, but seemed to me so just and true that none could controvert it. No, sir, says Johnson, 'tis not so. That's your mistake, and I can show an instance if you doubt it. You, sir, who are near 48, may much improve, 'tis not too late. I wish you'd set about it. Encouraged thus to mend my faults, I turned his counsel in my thoughts, which way I should apply it. Learning and wit seemed past my reach, for who can learn where none will teach? And wit I could not buy it. Then come, my friends, and try your skill. You can improve me if you will. My books are at a distance. With you I'll live and learn, and then instead of books I shall read men, so lend me your assistance. Dear Knight of Plympton, teach me how to suffer with unruffled brow, and smile serene like thine, the jest uncouth or truth severe, to such apply my deafest ear, and calmly drink my wine. Thou sayest, not only skill is gained, but genius too may be obtained, by studious imitation. Thy temper mild, thy genius fine, I'll copy till I make them mine, by constant application. Thy art of pleasing teach me, Garrick, thou who reversest odes Pindaric, a second time read o'er. Oh, could we read thee backwards too, last 30 years thou shouldst review, and charm us 30 more. If I have thoughts and can't express 'em, Gibbon shall teach me how to dress 'em, in terms select and terse. Jones teach me modesty and Greek, Smith how to think, Burke how to speak, and Beauclerk to converse. Let Johnson teach me how to place in fairest light each borrowed grace, from him I'll learn to write. Copy his clear and easy style, and grow from roughness of his file, grow as himself, polite. Miss Reynolds' version. I lately thought no man alive could e'er improve past 45, and ventured to assert it. The observation was not new, but seemed to me so just and true that none could controvert it. No, sir, says Johnson, 'tis not so. 'Tis your mistake, and I can show an instance if you doubt it. You, who perhaps are near 48, may still improve, 'tis not too late. I wish you'd set about it. Encouraged thus to mend my faults, I turned his counsel in my thoughts, which way I could apply it. Genius, I knew, was past my reach, for who can learn what none can teach? When and wit I could not buy it. Then come, my friends, and try your skill. You may improve me, if you will. My books are at a distance. With you I'll live and learn, and then instead of books I shall read men, so lend me your assistance. Dear Knight of Plympton, teach me how to suffer with unclouded brow, and smile serene as thine, the jest uncouth and truth severe, like thee to turn my deafest ear, and calmly drink my wine. Thou sayest, not only skill is gained, but genius too may be attained, by studious invitation. Thy temper mild, thy genius fine, I'll study till I make them mine, by constant meditation. Thy art of pleasing teach me, Garrick, thou who reverest odes Pindaric, a second time read o'er. Oh, could we read thee backwards too, past 30 years thou shouldst review, and charm us 30 more. If I have thoughts and can't express 'em, Gibbon shall teach me how to dress 'em, in terms select and terse. Jones teach me modesty and Greek, Smith how to think, Burke how to speak, and Beauclerk to converse. Let Johnson teach me how to place in fairest light each borrowed grace, from him I'll learn to write. Copy his free and easy style, and from the roughness of his file, grow like himself, polite. Annual Register. I lately thought no man alive could e'er improve past 45, and ventured to assert it. The observation was not new, but seemed to me so just and true that none could controvert it. No, sir, says Johnson, 'tis not so. That's your mistake, and I can show an instance if you doubt it. You, sir, who are near 48, may much improve, 'tis not too late. I wish you'd set about it. Encouraged thus to mend my faults, I turned his counsel in my thoughts, which way I should apply it. Learning and wit seemed past my reach, for who can learn when none will teach? And wit I could not buy it. Then come, my friends, and try your skill. You can inform me, if you will. My books are at a distance. With you I'll live and learn, and then, instead of books, I shall read men, to lend me your assistance. Dear Knight of Plimpton, teach me how to suffer with unruffled brow, and smile serene like thine. The jest uncouth or truth severe, to such apply my deafest ear. I'll turn and drink my wine. Thou sayest, not only skill is gained, but genius too may be attained by studious imitation. Thy temper mild, thy genius fine, I'll copy till I make thee mine, by constant application. Thy art to pleasing teach me, Garrick, thou who reverest odes Pindaric. O second time read o'er. Oh, could we read thee backwards too, last 30 years thou shouldst review, and charm us 30 more. If I have thoughts and can't express 'em, Gibbon shall teach me how to dress 'em, in terms select and terse. Jones teach me modesty and Greek, Smith how to think, Burke how to speak, Burke and Beauclerk to converse. Let Johnson teach me how to place in fairest light each borrowed grace, from him I'll learn to write. Copy his clear and easy style, and from the roughness of his file, grow like himself, polite. Horace Walpole, on December 27th, 1775, speaks of these verses as if they were fresh. They are an answer, he writes, to a gross brutality of Dr. Johnson, to which a properer answer would have been to fling a glass of wine in his face. I have no patience with an unfortunate monster trusting to his helpless deformity for indemnity for any impertinence that his arrogance suggests, and who thinks that what he has read is an excuse for everything he says. It is strange that Walpole should be so utterly ignorant of Johnson's courage and bodily strength. The date of Walpole's letter makes me suspect that Richard Burke dated his January 6, 1775. He should have written 1776. And the blunder of a copyist changed his 1775 into 1773. End of Appendix A.
Appendix B of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anastasiia Solokha. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4 by James Boswell. Appendix B. Had Boswell continued the quotation from Priestley's Illustrations of Philosophical Necessity, he would have shown that though Priestley could not hate the rioters, he could very easily prosecute them. He says, "If a necessarian I cease to blame men for their vices in the ultimate sense of the word, though in the common and proper sense of it I continue to do as much as other persons, for how necessarily soever they act, they are influenced by a base and mischievous disposition of mind, against which I must guard myself and others in proportion as I love myself and others," etc. Of his interview with Johnson, Priestley, in his Appeal to the Public, Part 2, published in 1792, thus writes, answering the impudent falsehood that when I was at Oxford, Dr. Johnson left a company of my being introduced to it. In fact, we never were at Oxford at the same time, and the only interview I ever had with him was at Mr. Paradise's, where we dined together at his own request. He was particularly civil to me, and promised to call upon me the next time he should go through Birmingham. He behaved with the same civility to Dr. Price when they sat together at Dr. Adams' at Oxford. Several circumstances show that Dr. Johnson had not so much of bigotry at the decline of life as had distinguished him before, on which account it is well known to all our common acquaintance that I declined all their pressing solicitations to be introduced to him. Priestley expresses himself ill, but his meaning can be made out. Parr answered Boswell in the March number of the Gentleman Magazine for 1795. But the evidence that he brings is rendered needless by Priestley's positive statement. May peace henceforth fall on Priestley's injured name. When Boswell asserts that Johnson was particularly resolute in not giving countenance to men whose writing he considered as pernicious to society, he forgets that very summer of 1783 he had been willing to dine at Wilkie's house. Dr. Franklin wrote to Dr. Price in 1784. It is said that scarce anybody but yourself and Dr. Priestley possesses the art of knowing how to differ decently. Gibbon, describing in 1789 the honestest members of French Assembly, calls them a set of wild visionaries, like our Dr. Price, who gravely debate and dream about the establishment of a pure and perfect democracy of 25 millions, the virtues of the golden age, and the primitive rights and equality of mankind. Admiration of Price met Samuel Rogers when a boy wished to be a preacher. I thought there was nothing on earth so grand as to figure in a pulpit. Dr. Price lived much in the society of Lord Lansdowne, Earl of Shelburne, and other people of rank, and his manners were extremely polished. In the pulpit he was great indeed. The full title of the tract mentioned by Boswell is A Small Whole Length of Dr. Priestley from his printed works. It was published in 1792 and is a very poor piece of writing. Johnson had refused to meet the Abbé Raynal, the author of the Histoire philosophique et politique du commerce des deux Indes, when he was over in England in 1777. Mrs. Chapone, writing to Mrs. Carter on the 15th of June of that year, says, I suppose you have heard a great deal at the Abbé Raynal, who is in London. I fancy you would have served him as Dr. Johnson did, to whom, when Mrs. Vesey introduced him, he turned from him and said he had read his book and would have nothing to say to him. See Walpole's letters. His book was burned by the common hangman in Paris. Carlyle's French Revolution, edition 1857. End of Appendix B. Appendix C of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anastasiia Solokha. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4 by James Boswell. Appendix C. Hawkins gives the two following notes. Dear Sir, as Mr. Ryland was talking with me of old friends and past times, we warmed ourselves into a wish that all who remained of the club should meet and dine at the house which once was Horseman's, in Ivy Lane. I have undertaken to solicit you, and therefore desire you to tell on what day next week you can conveniently meet your old friends. I am, Sir, your most humble servant, Samuel Johnson. Boat Court, the 22nd of November, 1783. Dear Sir, in perambulating Ivy Lane, Mr. Ryland found neither our landlord Horseman nor his successor. The old house is shut up, and he liked not the appearance of any near it. He therefore bespoke our dinner at the Queen's Arms in St. Paul's Churchyard, where, at half an hour after 3, your company will be desired today by those who remain of our former society. Your humble servant, Samuel Johnson. The 3rd of December. Format: Johnson, Hawkins, Ryland, and Payne. We dined, Hawkins continues, and in the evening regaled with coffee. At 10 we broke up, much to the regret of Johnson, who proposed staying. But finding us inclined to separate, he left us with a sigh that seemed to come from his heart, lamenting that he was retiring to solitude and cheerless meditation. Hawkins is mistaken in saying that they had a second meeting at a tavern at the end of a month. For Johnson, on the 10th of March, 1784, wrote, I have been confined from the 14th of December, and know not when I shall get out. He thus describes these meetings. The 13th of December. I dined about a fortnight ago with 3 old friends. We had not met together for 30 years, and one of us thought the other grown very old. In the 30 years 2 of our set have died. Our meeting may be supposed to be somewhat tender. The 12th of January, 1784. I had the same old friends to dine with me on Wednesday, and may say that since I lost sight of you I have had one pleasant day. The 15th of April, 1784. Yesterday I had the pleasure of giving another dinner to the remainder of the old club. We used to meet weekly about the year 50, and we were as cheerful as in former times. Only I could not make quite so much noise, for since the paralytic affliction my voice is sometimes weak. The 19th of April, 1784. The people whom I mentioned in my letter are the remnant of a little club that used to meet in Ivy Lane about 33 years ago, out of which we have lost Hawksworth and Dyer. The rest are yet on this side the grave. Our meetings now are serious, and I think of all parts tender. End of Appendix C.
Appendix D of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4 by James Boswell. Appendix D. It is likely that Sir Joshua Reynolds refused to join the Essex Head Club because he did not wish to meet Barry. Not long before this time he had censured Barry's delay in entering upon his duties as professor of painting. Barry answered, "If I had no more to do in the composition of my lectures than to produce such poor flimsy stuff as your discourses, I should soon have done my work, and be prepared to read." It is said this speech was delivered with fist clenched in a menacing posture. The Honourable Daines Barrington was the author of an essay on the migration of birds and of observations on the statutes. Horace Walpole wrote on November 24th, 1780, "I am sorry for the Dean of Exeter. If he dies, I conclude the leaden mace of the Antiquarian Society will be given to Judge Barrington." He was Second Justice of Chester. Of Mr. John Nichols, Murphy says that his attachment to Dr. Johnson was unwearied. He was the printer of the Lives of the Poets, and the author of Biographical and Literary Anecdotes of William Boyer, printer, the last of the learned printers, whose apprentice he had been. Horace Walpole says, "I scarce ever saw a book so correct as Mr. Nichols' Life of Mr. Boyer. I wish it deserved the pains he had bestowed on it every way, and that he would not dub so many men great. I have known several of his heroes, who were very little men." The Life of Boyer, being recast and enlarged, was republished under the title of Literary Anecdotes of the 18th Century. From 1778 till his death in 1826, the Gentleman's Magazine was in great measure in his hands. Southey, writing in 1804, says, "I have begun to take in here at Keswick the Gentleman's Magazine, alias the Old Womania, to enlighten a Portuguese student among the mountains. It does amuse me by its exquisite inanity, and the glorious and intense stupidity of its correspondence. It is, in truth, a disgrace to the age and the country." Mr. William Cook, commonly called Conversation Cook, wrote Lives of Macklin and Foote. Mr. Richard Paul Jodrell, or Jodrell, was the author of The Persian Heroine, a tragedy, which, in Baker's Biographica Dramatica, Volume 1, page 400, is wrongly assigned to Sir R. P. Jodrell, M.D. Dr. Horsley was the controversialist, later on Bishop of St. David's, and next to Rochester. Gibbon makes splendid mention of him when he tells how Dr. Priestley's Socinian shield has repeatedly been pierced by the mighty spear of Horsley. Wyndham, however, in his Diary, in one place speaks of him as having his thoughts intent wholly on prospects of church preferment. And in another place he says that he often lays down with great confidence what turns out afterwards to be wrong. In the House of Lords he once said that he did not know what the mass of people in any country had to do with the laws but to obey them. Thurlow rewarded him for his letters to Priestley by a stall at Gloucester, saying that those who supported the church should be supported by it. Hawkins thus writes of the formation of the club, "I was not made privy to this his intention, but all circumstances considered, it was no matter of surprise to me when I heard that the great Dr. Johnson had, in the month of December, 1783, formed a sixpenny club at an alehouse in Essex Street, and that though some of the persons thereof were persons of note, strangers, under restrictions, for 3d. each night, might 3 nights in a week hear him talk and partake of his conversation." Miss Hawkins says, "Boswell was very well justified in his resentment of my father's designation of this club as a sixpenny club, meeting at an alehouse. Honestly speaking, I dare say my father did not like being passed over." Sir Joshua Reynolds, writing of the club, says, "Any company was better than none, by which Johnson connected himself with many mean persons whose presence he could command. For this purpose he established a club at a little alehouse in Essex Street, composed of a strange mixture of very learned and very ingenious odd people. Of the former were Dr. Heberden, Mr. Wyndham, Mr. Boswell, Mr. Stevens, Mr. Paradise. Those of the latter I do not think proper to enumerate. It is possible that Reynolds had not seen the Essex Head, and that the term little alehouse he had borrowed from Hawkins's account. Possibly, too, his disgust at Barry here found vent. Murphy says, "The members of the club were respectable for their rank, their talents, and their literature. The Little Alehouse Club saw one of its members, Alderman Clark, Lord Mayor within a year, another, Horsley, a bishop within 5 years, and a third, Wyndham, Secretary at War within 10 years. Nichols gives a list of the constant members at the time of Johnson's death." End of Appendix D.
Appendix E of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anastasiia Solokha. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4, by James Boswell. Appendix E. Miss Burney's account of Johnson's last days is interesting, but her dates are confused more even than is common with her. I have corrected them as well as I can. The 9th of December. He will not, it seems, be talked to, at least very rarely. At times, indeed, he reanimates, but it is soon over, and he says of himself, "I am now like Macbeth. Question enrages me." The 10th of December. At night my father brought us the most dismal tidings of dear Dr. Johnson. He had thanked and taken leave of all his physicians. Alas! I shall lose him, and he will take no leave of me. My father was deeply depressed. I hear from everyone he is now perfectly resigned to his approaching fate, and no longer in terror of death. The 11th of December. My father in the morning saw this first of men. He was up and very composed. He took his hand very kindly, asked after all his family, and then in particular how Fanny did. I hope, he said, Fanny did not take it amiss that I did not see her. I was very bad. Tell Fanny to pray for me. After which, still grasping his hand, he made a prayer for himself, the most fervent, pious, humble, eloquent, and touching, my father says, that ever was composed. Oh, would I had heard it! He ended it with Amen, in which my father joined, and was echoed by all present. And again, when my father was leaving him, he brightened up, something of his outlook returned, and he said, "I think I shall throw the ball at Fanny yet." The 12th of December. Miss Burney called at Bolt Court. All the rest went away but Mrs. Davis, a good sort of woman, whom this truly charitable soul had sent for to take a dinner at his house. Mr. Langton then came. He could not look at me, and I turned away from him. Mrs. Davis asked how the doctor was. "Going on to death very fast," was his mournful answer. "Has he taken," said she, "anything?" "Nothing at all. We carried him some bread and milk. He refused, and said, 'The less, the better.'" The 20th of December. This day was the ever-honored, ever-lamented Dr. Johnson committed to the earth. Oh, how sad a day to me! My father attended. I could not keep my eyes dry all day, nor can I now in the recollecting it. But let me pass over what to mourn is now so vain. End of Appendix E.
Section 55 of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeanie Whitfield. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4, by James Boswell. Section 55. Appendix F. Notes on Boswell's notes on pages 403 to 405. F1. In a letter quoted by Mr. Crocker's Boswell, page 427, Dr. Johnson calls Thomas Johnson cousin, and says that in the last 16 months he has given him £40. He mentions his death in 1779. P.O.Z. Letters, Volume 2, 45. F2. Hawkins, Life, page 603, says that Elizabeth Hearn was Johnson's first cousin, and that he had constantly, for how long he doesn't say, contributed £15 toward her maintenance. F3. For Mauritius Lowe, see ante 3, 324, and 4, 201. F4. To Mr. Wyndham. 2 days earlier he had given a copy of the New Testament, saying, Extremum hoc munus morientis habeto. Wyndham's Diary, page 28. F5. For Mrs. Gardiner, see ante 1, 242. F6. Mr. Desmoulins was the son of Mrs. Desmoulins, ante 3, 222, and 368, and the grandson of Johnson's godfather, Dr. Swinfen, ante 1, 34. Johnson mentions him in a letter to Mrs. Thrale in 1778. Young Desmoulins is taken in an under something of Drury Lane. He knows not, I believe, his own denomination. P.O.Z. Letters, 2, 25. F7. The reference to The Rambler, number 41, not 42 as Boswell says, where Johnson mentions those vexations and anxieties with which all human enjoyments are polluted. F8. Bishop Sanderson describes his soul as infinitely polluted with sin. Walton's Lives, edition, 1838, page 396. F9. Hume, writing in 1742 about his essays moral and political, says, Innes, the great bookseller in Paul's Churchyard, wonders there is not a new edition, for that he cannot find copies for his customers. J. H. Burton's Hume, I. 143. F10. Nichols, Lit. Annex 2, 554, says that on December 7th, Johnson asked him whether any of the family of Phaedon, the printer, were living. Being told that the geographer near Charing Cross was Phaedon's son, he said after a short pause, I borrowed a guinea of his father, near 30 years ago. Be so good as to take this, and pay it for me. F11. Nowhere does Hawkins more shew the malignancy of his character than in his attacks on Johnson's black servant, and through him on Johnson. With the passage in which this offensive caveat is found, he brings his work to a close. At the first mention of Frank, Life, page 328, he says, His first master in a great humanity made him a Christian, and his last, for no assignable reason, nay, rather in despite of nature, and to unfit him for being useful according to his capacity, determined to make him a scholar. But Hawkins was a brutal fellow. See ante I. 27, note 2, and 28, note. F12. Johnson had written to Taylor on October 23rd of this year. Coming down from a very restless night, I found your letter, which made me a little angry. You tell me that recovery is in my power. This indeed I should be glad to hear, if I could once believe it. But you mean to charge me with neglecting or opposing my own health. Tell me, therefore, what I do that hurts me, and what I neglect that could help me. This letter is endorsed by Taylor. This is the last letter, my answer, which were the words of advice he gave to Mr. Thrale the day he died. He resented extremely from me. Mr. Alfred Morrison's collection of autographs, etc., 2, 343. The words of advice which were given to Mr. Thrale the day before the fatal fit seized him were that he should abstain from full meals. Ante 4, 84. Note 4. Johnson's resentment of Taylor's advice may account for the absence of his name in his will. F13. They were sold in 650 lots in a 4-days sale. Besides the books, there were 146 portraits, of which 61 were framed and glazed. These prints in their frames were sold in lots of 4, 8, and even 10 together, although certainly some of them, and perhaps many, were engravings from Reynolds. The catalogue of the sale is in the Bodleian Library. End of section 55.
Appendix G of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anastasiia Solokha. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4 by James Boswell. Appendix G. Mrs. Percy records that Johnson told her. When Boyce was almost perishing with hunger, and some money was produced to purchase him a dinner, he got a bit of roast beef, but could not eat it without ketchup, and laid out the last half-guinea he possessed in truffles and mushrooms, eating them in bed too, for want of clothes or even a shirt to sit up in. Hawkins gives 1740 as the year of Boyce's destitution. He was, he says, confined to a bed which had no sheets. Here to produce food, he wrote, his posture sitting up in bed, his only covering a blanket in which a hole was made to admit of the employment of his arm. 2 years later, Boyce wrote the following verses to Kiev from a sponging house. Odie teste quelle sumo, sine pane, sine numo, sorte positus in feste, scribo tibi dolens mo este. Fame, bile tumet jecur, urbane mite opem precur, tibi enim corumanum, non amalis alienum, mi mens ne male grato, pora te favore dato. Ex geena debitoria, vulgo domo spongiatoria. He adds that he hopes to have his ode on the British nation done that day. This ode, which is given in the Gentleman's Magazine 1742, contains the following verse, which contrasts sadly with the poor poet's case. Thou, sacred isle, amidst thy ambient main, enjoyest the sweets of freedom all thy own. It is not likely that Johnson called a sixpence a serious consideration. He, who in his youth would not let his comrades say prodigious, was not likely in his old age so to misuse a word. It was not on the return from Skye, but on the voyage from Skye to Raasay that the spurs were lost. Dr. White's Bampton lectures on 1784 became part of the triumphant literature of the University of Oxford and got the preacher a Christ Church canonry. Of these lectures, Dr. Parr had written about 1/5 part. White, writing to Parr about a passage in the manuscript of the last lecture, said, I fear I did not clearly explain myself. I humbly beg the favor of you to make my meaning more intelligible. On the death of Mr. Badcock in 1788, a note for £500 from White was found in his pocket book. White pretended that this was remuneration for some other work, but it was believed on good grounds that Badcock had begun what Parr had completed, and that these famous lectures were mainly their work. Badcock was one of the writers in the Monthly Review. Virgilium Viditantum, Ovid, Tristia. Mackintosh says of Priestley, frankness and disinterestedness in the avowal of his opinion were his point of honor. He goes on to point out that there was great mental power in him wasted and scattered. Badcock, in using the term index scholar, was referring no doubt to Pope's lines. How index learning turns no student pale, yet holds the ill of science by the tail. End of Appendix G.
Appendix H of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4, by James Boswell. Appendix H. The last lines of the inscription on this urn are borrowed, with a slight change, from the last paragraph of The Last Rambler. Johnson visited Colonel Middleton on August 29th, 1774, in his tour to Wales. Johnson, writing to Dr. Taylor on September 3rd, 1783, said, "I sat to Opie, sick, as long as he desired, and I think the head is finished, but it is not much admired." Hawkins says that in 1784 Johnson resumed sitting to Opie, but, he adds, "I believe the picture was never finished." Of this picture, which was the one painted for the Beauclerk, it is stated in Johnson's work, edition 1787, 11-204, that there is in it that appearance of a labouring working mind, of an indolent reposing body, which he had to a very great degree. It seems almost certain that the portrait of Johnson in the Common Room of University College, Oxford, is this very mezzotinto. It was given to the college by Sir William Scott, and it is a mezzotinto from Opie's portrait. It has been reproduced for this work, and will be found facing page 244 of Volume 3. Scott's inscription on the back of the frame is given on page 245, note 3 of the same volume. End of Appendix H.
Appendix I of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeanie Whitfield from Traditions in Biloxi, Mississippi. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4, by James Boswell. Appendix I. Boswell most likely never knew that in the year 1790, Mr. Seward, in the name of Cadell the publisher, had asked Parr to write a life of Johnson. Parr, in his amusing vanity, was as proud of this life as if he had written it. "It would have been," he said, "the third most learned work that has ever yet appeared. The most learned work ever published, I consider, Bentley, on the Epistles of Phalaris. The next, Salmasius, on the Hellenistic language." Alluding to Boswell's life, he continued, "Mine should have been, not the droppings of his lips, but the history of his mind." In the epitaph that he first sent in were found the words Probabili Poetae. "In arms," wrote Parr, "were all the Johnsonians, Malone, Stevens, Sir W. Scott, Wyndham, and even Fox. All in arms. The epithet was cold. They do not understand it, and I am a scholar, not a belles lettres man." Parr had wished to pass over all notice of Johnson's poetical character. To this Malone said none of his friends of the literary club would agree. He pointed out also that Parr had not noticed that part of Johnson's genius, which placed him on higher ground than perhaps any other quality that can be named, the universality of his knowledge, the promptness of his mind in producing it on all occasions in conversation, and the vivid eloquence with which he clothed his thoughts, however suddenly called upon. Parr, regardless of Johnson's rule that in lapidary inscriptions a man is not upon oath, replied that if he mentioned his conversation he should have to mention also his roughness and contradiction, etc. As for the epithet Probabili, he never reflected upon it without almost a triumphant feeling in its felicity. Nevertheless, he would change it into Poetae sententiarum et verborum ponderibus admirabile. Yet these words, energetic and sonorous though they were, fill one with a secret and invincible loathing, because they tend to introduce into the epitaph a character of magnificence. With every fresh objection he rose in importance, he wrote for the approbation of real scholars of generations yet unborn. That the epitaph was written by such or such a man will, from the publicity of the situation and the popularity of the subject, be long remembered. No objections seem to have been raised to the 5 pompous lines of perplexing dates and numerals, in which no room is found even for Johnson's birth and birthplace. "After I had written the epitaph," wrote Parr to a friend, "Sir Joshua Reynolds told me there was a scroll. I was in a rage. A scroll! Why, Ned, this is vile modern contrivance. I wanted one train of ideas. What could I do with the scroll? Johnson held it, and Johnson must speak it. I thought of this, his favorite maxim in the Life of Milton. Greek, ati toi in megarosi, kakon to agathon te tu ktai. In Homer, you know, and shewing the excellence of moral philosophy. There Johnson and Socrates agree. Mr. Seward, hearing of my difficulty, and no scholar, suggested the closing line in the Rambler. Had I looked there, I should have anticipated the suggestion. It is the closing line in Dionysius's Perigesis. Greek. Anton ek makaron antaxios ie I emoi pai. I adopted it, and gave Seward the praise. Oh, quoth Sir William Scott, Greek, makaron, is heathenish, and the dean and chapter will hesitate. The more fools they, said I. But to prevent disputes, I have altered it. Greek, in makaresi, phonom, and taxios, ein amoibai. Though the inscription on the scroll is not strictly speaking part of the epitaph, yet this mixture of Greek and Latin is open to the censure Johnson passed on Pope's epitaph on Craig's. It may be proper to remark, he said, the absurdity of joining in the same inscription Latin and English, or verse and prose. If either language be preferable to the other, let that only be used, for no reason can be given why part of the information should be given in one tongue and part in another, on a tomb more than on any other place or on any other occasion. Bacon the sculptor was anxious, wrote Malone, that posterity should know that he was entitled to annex R.A. to his name. Parr was ready to give his name, lest, if it were omitted, Bacon should slyly put the figure of a hog on Johnson's monument, just as Cyrus and Batrachus, when Octavia would not give them leave to set their names on the temples they had built in Rome, scattered one of them, Greek sauri, lizards, and the other Greek batrachoi, frogs, on the bases and capitals of the columns. But as for the R.A., the sculptor very reluctantly had to agree to its omission. End of section 58. End of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 4, by James Boswell.